Anyway, welcome back to Paper Cuts. This week we're finally, hopefully, finishing Brigands of the Moon, which has far overstayed its welcome in my opinion, but still isn't half bad. Of course, as soon as I start recording, I have to sneeze. Oh, give me a second. There we go. Sorry about that. Chapter 34, The First Encounters. It seemed that with the first shot from the enemy that a great relief came to me. An apprehension had fallen away. We had anticipated this moment for so long and dreaded it. I think all our men felt it. A shout went up, "Harmless!" It wasn't that, but our building withstood it better than I had feared. It was a flash from a large electronic projector mounted on the deck of the brigand ship. It stabbed up from the shadows across the valley, at the foot of the opposite crater wall, a beam of vaguely fluorescent light. Simultaneously, the searchlight vanished. The stream of electrons caught the footfront. The stream of the electrons. Can I please speak English? The stream of electrons caught the front face of our main building in a 6-foot circle. It held a few seconds, vanished, and then stabbed again, and still again. 3 bolts. A total, I suppose, of around 9 or 10 seconds. I was standing with Grantline at a front window. We had rigged an oblong of insulated fabric like a curtain, and we stood peering, holding the curtain cautiously aside. The ray struck some 20 feet away from us. "Harmless!" The men in the room shouted it with derision, but Grantline swung on them. "Don't think that." An interior signal panel was beside Grantline. He called the dutyman in the instrument room. "It's over. What are your readings?" The bombarding electrons had passed through the outer shell of the building's double wall and had been absorbed in the rarefied, magnetized air current of the Errant's circulation. Like poison in a man's veins, reaching his heart, the free alien electrons had disturbed the motors. They had accelerated and then slowed, pulsed unevenly, and drew added power from the reserve tanks, but they'd normalized at once when the shot was past. The dutyman's voice sounded from the grid and answered Grantline's question. 5 degrees colder in your building, can't you feel it?" The disturbed, weakened Errant's circulation had allowed the outer cold to radiate through a trifle. The walls had a trifle extra explosive pressure from the room air, a strain, but that was all. It's probably their most powerful single weapon, Greg. Yes, I think so. I'd smashed the real giant with its 10-mile range. The ship was only 2 miles from us, but it seemed as though this projector were exerted to its distance limit. I had noticed on deck only one of this type. The others, paralyzing rays and heat rays, were less deadly. "We can withstand a lot of that bombardment if we stay inside." That ray, striking a man outside, would penetrate his Errant suit in a few seconds, we couldn't doubt. But we had no intention of going out, unless for dire necessity. Even so, a hand shield would hold it off for a certain length of time. We had an opportunity, a moment later, to test our insulated shields, and the bolt came again. It darted along the front face of the building, caught our window, and clung. The double shell windows were our weakest points. The sheet of flashing Errant's current was transparent. We could see through it as though it were glass. It moved faster, but was thinner at the windows than in the walls. We feared the bombarding electrons might cross it, penetrate the inner shell, and, like a lightning bolt, enter the room. We dropped the curtain corner, and the radiance of the bolt was dimly visible. A few seconds, and then it vanished again, and behind the shield we had felt not a tingle. "Harmless!" But our power had been drained nearly an arrow to neutralize the shock to the Errant's current, Grantline said. "If they kept that up, it'd be a question of whose power supply would last longest, and it wouldn't be ours. You saw our lights fade down while the bolt was striking?" But the brigands didn't know we were short of power, and to fire the projector with a continuous bolt would, in 30 minutes perhaps, have exhausted their own power reserve. This was such strange warfare. It was new to all of us. There had been no wars on any of the 3 inhabited worlds for many years. Silent, electronic conflict, Not a question of men in battle. A man at the switch on the brigand ship was the sole actor so far in this assault, and the results were visible only in the movement of the needle dials on our instrument panels. A struggle so far not of man's bravery or skill or strategy, but merely of electronic power supply. Yet warfare, however modern, cannot transcend the human element. Before this insult was ended, I was to have many demonstrations of that. "I won't answer them," Grantline declared. "Our game is to sit defensive, conserve everything, and let them make the waiting moves." We waited half an hour, but no other shot came. The valley floor was patched with earthlight and shadow. We could see the vague outline of the brigand ship backed up at the foot of the opposite crater wall. The form of its dome over the illumined deck was visible, and the line of its tiny hull ovals. On the rocks near the ship, helmet lights of prowling brigands occasionally showed. Whatever activity was going on down there, we couldn't see with the naked eye, and Grantline didn't dare use our telescope at first. To connect it, even for local range, drew on precious ammunition of power. Some of the men urged that we search the sky with the telescope. Was our rescue ship from Earth coming? Yet Grantline refused. We were in no trouble yet, and every delay was to our advantage. "Commander, where should I put these helmets?" A man came wheeling a pile of helmets on a little truck. "At the manual port in the other building." Our weapons and outside equipment were massed at the main exit locks of the large building, but we might want to sally out through the smaller locks also. Grantline sent helmets there. Suits were not needed as most of us were garbed in them now, but without the helmets. Snap was still in the workshop. I went there during this first half hour of the attack. 10 of our men were busy there with little flying platforms and the fabric shields. How is it, Snap?" "It's almost all ready." He'd used 6 of the platforms, including the one we'd already used, and more than a dozen hand shields. At a squeeze, all of us could ride on these 6 little vehicles. We might even have to ride them. We planned that in the event of disaster to the buildings, we could at least escape in this fashion. Food supplies and water were now being placed at the ports. Depressing preparations. Our buildings uninhabitable, a rush out and away, abandoning the treasure. Grantline had never mentioned such a contingency, but I noticed nevertheless that preparations were being made. "Only that one shot, Greg?" Snap's voice was raised over the clang of workmen bolting the little gravity plates on the last platform. 4 blasts, but just the one projector. Their strongest." He grinned, and wore no errant suit as yet. He stood in torn, grimy work trousers and a bedraggled shirt, with the inevitable red eye shade holding back his unruly hair. Round his waist was the weighted belt, and there were weights on his shoes for gravity stability. "Didn't seem to hurt us much." "Nope." "When I get the tube panels in this thing, I'll be finished. It'll take another half hour, and I'll join you. Where are you stationed?" I shrugged. "I was at a front window with Johnny. Nothing to do as yet." "Well, the longer they delay, the better for us," Snap said, going back to his work. "If only your signal got through, Greg, we'll have a rescue ship here in a few hours more." Oh, that if. I turned away. "Can't help you, Snap? Can't help you, Snap?" "No. Take those shields," he added to one of the men. "To take them where?" "To Grantline. The front admission port or the back, he'll tell you which." The shields were wheeled away on a little cart, and I followed it, and Grantline sent it to the back exit. "No other move from them yet, Johnny?" "No, all quiet. Snap's almost finished." The brigands presently made another play. A giant heat ray beam came across the valley, and it clung to our front wall for nearly a minute. Grantline got the reports from the instrument room, and he laughed.
"That helped rather than hurt us. Heated the outer wall. Frank took advantage of it and eased up the motors."
We wondered if Miko knew that. Doubtless he did, for another interval passed, and the heat ray wasn't used again. Then came a Z-ray. I stood at the window, watching it, a faint sheen of beam in the dimness. It crept with sinister deliberation along our front building wall, clung momentarily to our shielded windows, and pried with its revealing glow into Snap's workshop. "Looking us over. I hope they like what they see." I knew he didn't feel the bravado that was in his tone. We had nothing but small hand weapons. Heat rays, electronic projectors, and bullet projectors, all for very short-range fighting. If Miko had not known that before, he could at least make a good guess at it after the careful Z-ray inspection. With his ship down there 2 miles away, we were powerless to reach him. And it seemed that Miko was now testing the use of all his mechanisms. A light flare went up from the dome peak of the ship. It rose in a slow arc over the valley and burst. For a few seconds, the 2-mile circle of crags was brilliantly illumined. I stared, but I had to shield my eyes against the dazzling actinic glare. I could see nothing. Was Miko making a Z-ray photograph of our interiors? We had no way of knowing. He was testing his short-range projectors now. With my eyes again accustomed to the normal Earthlight in the valley, I could see the stabs of little electronic beams, the Martian paralyzing rays and heat beams. They darted out like flashing swords from the rocks near the ship. And then the whole ship and the crater wall behind it seemed to shift sidewise, as a Benson curve light spread its glow about the ship, with a projector curve beam coming up and touching the window, through which I was peering. "Aljon, look at these. Commander, shall I stop them? They'll kill themselves or kill us or smash something." We followed the man into the building's broad central corridor. Anita and Venza were riding a small flying platform. Anita in her boyish black garb and Venza with a flowing white Venus robe. They lay on the tiny 6-foot oblong of metal, one manipulating its side shields and the other at the controls. As we arrived, the platform... sorry about that. As we arrived, the platform came sliding down the narrow confines of the corridor, lurching, barely missing a door grid projection. Up to skim the low vaulted ceiling and then down to the floor. It sailed past our heads and rose over us as we ducked. Anita waved. "By the infernal!" "Anita, stop!" But they only waved at us, skimming down the length of the corridor, seeming to avoid a smash a dozen times by the smallest margin of chance, stopping miraculously at the further end, and hanging poised in midair, they wheeled and came back, undulating up and down. In spite of my astonished horror, I couldn't but share in Grantline's obvious admiration. 3 of the 4 other men were watching. The girls were remarkably skillful, there was no doubt of that. There was clearly not a man among us who could have handled that gravity platform indoors, not one who had the brash temerity to even try it. The platform landed with the grace of a hummingbird at our feet, the girls dexterously balancing, so it came to rest swiftly, without the least bump. "Anita, what are you doing?" She stood up, and she was flushed, and smiled at me. "I'm practicing." Imperturbable girls, the product of their age. Oblivious to the brigand attack, they were in here practicing. Practicing what for? Venza's roguish eyes twinkled at me, and her hands went to her hips with a gesture of defiance. "Are you speaking for yourself or the commander?" I ignored her. "What for?" I reiterated. "Because we're good at it. Better than any of you men if you should need us." "We don't, and we won't," I said shortly. "But if you should," Venza put in. "If Snap and I hadn't come for you, you wouldn't be here, Greg Haljan. I didn't notice you were so horrified to see me holding that shield up over you." That silenced me. And then she added, "Commander, let us alone. We won't smash anything."
"I hope you won't."
Grantline laughed. A warning call took us back to the front window. The brigand's search beam was once again being used. It swept slowly along the length of the cliff, and the circle went down the cliff steps to the valley floor, and came sweeping up again. And then it went up to the observatory platform at the summit above us, and then back and crept over to the ore sheds. We had no men outside, if that was what the brigand wanted to determine. The search beam presently vanished, and it was replaced immediately by a Z-ray, which darted at once to our treasure shields and clung. That stung Grantline into his own first action. We flung our Z-ray down across the valley, and it reached the brigand ship. This Z-ray and a searchlight were our only two projectors of long range. The brigand ray vanished when ours flashed on. I was with Grantline at the image grid in the instrument room. We saw the deck of the brigand ship and the blurred interior of the cabins.
Try the search beam, Frank. We don't need the other.
The Z-ray went off, and we gazed down our searchlight, which clung to the dome of the distant enemy vessel. We could see movement there.
The telescope,
Grantline ordered. The little dynamos hummed, and the telescope finder glowed and clarified. On the deck of the ship, we saw the brigands working with the assembling of ore carts. A deck landing port was open. The ore carts were being carried out through a port lock and down a landing incline. And on the rocks outside, we saw several of the carts and rail sections and the sections of an ore chute. Miko was unloading his mining apparatus. He was making ready to come up for the treasure. The discovery, startling as it was, nevertheless was far overshadowed by an imperative danger alarm from our main building. Brigands were outside on our ledge. Miko's search beam, sweeping the ledge a moment before, had carefully avoided revealing them. It had been done just for that purpose, no doubt, making us sure that ledge was unoccupied, and thus to guard against our own light making a search. But there was a brigand group here close outside our walls. By the merest chance, the radiating glow from our search ray had shown the helmeted figures scurrying for shelter. Grantline leapt to his feet, and we rushed for the rear exit port, which was nearest us. The giant, bloated figures had been seen running along the outside of the connecting corridor in this direction. But before we ever got there, a new alarm came. A brigand was crouching at the front corner of the main building, and his hydrogen heat torch had already opened a rift in the wall. Oh, you must excuse all my yawns. I get this way when I sing, too. It's not about sleep, it's just about using musculature I don't normally use and it needing to stretch. You know? Anyway, chapter 35.
And with you. Get your helmets on. How many? Enough? 6? That's enough. Get back there, Williams. You were last. That lock won't hold any more.
I was one of the 6 who jammed into the manual exit lock. We went through it, and in a moment we were outside. It was less than 3 minutes since the prowling brigands had been seen. Grantline touched me just as we emerged.
Don't wait for orders. Go get them.
That fellow with the torch, the most dangerous.
Yes, I'm with you.
We went out with a rush. We had already discarded our shoe and belt weights, and I leapt regardless of my companions. The scurrying Martians had disappeared, and through my visor's bullseye I could see only the earthlit, rocky surface of the ledge. Beside me stretched the dark wall of our building. I bounded toward the front. The brigand with the torch had been at this front corner. I couldn't see him from here. He'd been crouching just around the angle. I had a tiny bullet projector, the best weapon for short range outdoors. I was aware of Grantline close beside me. It took only a few of my giant leaps. I landed at the corner, recovered my balance, and then whirled around to the front. And the Martian was here, a giant misshapen lump as he crouched. His torch was a little stab of blue in the deep shadows enveloping him. Intent upon his work, he didn't see me. Perhaps he thought his fellows had broken our exits by now. I landed like a leopard upon his back and fired, my weapon muzzle ramming him. His torch fell hissing with a silent rain of blue fires upon the rocks. As my grip upon him made autophone contact, his agonized scream rattled the diaphragms of my ear grids with horrible, deafening intensity. He lay under me and then was still. His scream choked into silence and his suit deflated within my grip. He was clearly dead. My leaden steel-tipped pellet had punctured the double surface of his Erentz fabric and penetrated him as well. Grantline's following leap landed him over me. Dead? Yes. I climbed from the inert body. The torch had hissed itself out. Grantline swung on our building corner, and I leaned down with him to examine it. The torch had fused and scarred the surface of the wall, burned almost through, and a pressure rift had opened. We could see it, a curving gash in the metal wall plate like a crack in a window glass pane. I went cold. This was serious damage. The rarefied Erentz air could seep out. It was leaking now. We could see the magnetic radiance of all of it up the length of the 10-foot crack. The leak would change the pressure of the Erentz system, constantly lower it, demanding steady renewal. The Erentz motors would overheat. Some might go bad from the strain. Grantline stood, gripping me.
That's bad.
Yes. Can't we repair it?
No, we have to take that whole plate section out, shut off the Erentz plant, and exhaust the interior air of this bulkhead of the building. It's a day's job, maybe more.
And the crack would get worse, I knew. It gradually spread and widened. The Erentz circulation would fail, and all our power would be drained struggling to maintain it. The brigand who had unwittingly... This brigand, by his daring act, had accomplished more than perhaps he'd realized. I could envisage our weapons, useless from lack of power, the air in our buildings turning fetid and frigid, ourselves forced to the helmets, a rush out to abandon the camp, and escape, the buildings exploding, scattering into litter on the ledge like a child's broken toy, the treasure abandoned with brigands coming up and loading it on a ship. Our defeat, in a few hours now, or perhaps even minutes. This crack would slowly widen, or it could break suddenly, at any time. Disaster come now so abruptly upon us, at the very start of the brigand attack. Grantline's voice in my autophone broke my despairing rush of thoughts.
It's bad. Come on, Greg, there's nothing to do here.
We were aware that our 4 other men had run along the building's other side, and they emerged now, the running brigands in front of them rushing out toward the staircase on the ledge. 3 giant Martian figures in flight, with our 4 men chasing. A bullet projector spat with its strange stab of exploding powder, fed by the oxygen-burning fumes of its artificial air chamber, one of our men firing. A brigand fell to the rocks by the brink of the ledge. The others reached the descending staircase and tumbled down it with reckless leaps. Our men turned back, and before we could join them, the enemy ship down in the valley sent up a cautious search beam, which located its returning men. Then the beam swung up to the ledge and landed upon us. We stood, confused, blinded by the brilliant glare.
Run, Greg, they'll be firing at us.
We dashed away, and our companions joined us, rushing back for the port. I saw it open, reinforcements coming out to help us. 6 figures carrying a 10-foot insulated shield. They could barely get it out through the port. The Martian search ray abruptly vanished, and then almost instantly the electronic ray came with its deadly stab. It missed us at first as we ran for the shield, but it vanished and stabbed again. It caught us, but now we were behind the shield, carrying it back to the port and hiding behind it. Whether Miko's instruments showed him how serious the damage was to our front wall, we never knew, but I think he realized. His search beam clung to it, and his Z-ray pried into our interiors. The brigand ship was active now. We were desperate and used our telescope freely for observation, and we used our Z-ray and searchlight as well. Miko's ore carts and mining apparatus were unloaded on the rocks. The rail sections were being carried a mile out, nearly to the center of the valley. A subsidiary camp was being established there, only a mile from the base of our cliff, but still far beyond the reach of our weapons. We could see the brigand lights down there. and then the ore chute sections were brought over. We could see Miko's men carrying some of the giant projectors, mounting them in a new position. Power tanks and cables, light flare catapults, little mechanical cannons for throwing the bombs. The enemy searchlight constantly raked our vicinity. Occasionally, the giant electronic projector flung up its bolt as though warning us not to dare leave our buildings. Half an hour went by, and our situation was even worse than Miko could know. The errant's motors were running hot, our power draining, the crack widening. When it would break we couldn't tell, but the danger was like a sword over us. An anxious 30 minutes for us, this second interlude. Grantline called for a meeting of all our little force, with every man having his say. Inactivity was no longer a feasible policy. We recklessly used our power to search the sky. Our rescue ship might be up there, but we couldn't see it with our disabled instruments. No signals came. We couldn't, or at least didn't, receive them. They wouldn't signal. They'd know the Martians be more likely to get the signal than us. Of what use to warn Miko? But he didn't dare wait for a rescue ship that might or might not be coming. Miko was playing the waiting game now, making ready for a quick loading of the ore when we were forced to abandon our buildings. And the brigand ship suddenly moved its position. It rose up in a low, flat arc, came forward and settled in the center of the valley, where the carts and the rail sections were piled, and the outside projectors newly mounted on the rocks. But the projectors only shot at us occasionally. The brigands now began laying the rails from the ship toward the base of our cliff. The chute would bring the ore down from the ledge, and the carts would take it to the ship. The laying of the rails was done under the cover of occasional stabs from the electronic projector. And then we discovered that Miko had made still another move. The brigand rays, fired from the depths of the valley, could strike our front building, but could not at all reach our ledge. And from the ship's new and nearer position, this disadvantage was intensified. Then abruptly we realized that under cover of darkness bombs, an electronic projector and search ray had been carried to the top of the crater rim, diagonally across and only half a mile from us. Their beams shot down, raking all our vicinity from this new angle. I was on the little flying platform which sallied out as a test to attack these isolated projectors. Snap and I and one other volunteer went. He and I held the shield and Snap handled the controls. Our exit port was on the lee side of the building from the hostile search beam. We got out unobserved and sailed upward, but soon a light from the ship caught us, and the projector bolts came up. Our sortie only lasted a few minutes. To me, it was a confusion of crossing beams with the stars overhead, the swaying little platform under me, and the shield tingling in my hands when the blast struck us. Moments of blurred terror. The voice of the man beside me sounded in my ears. "Now hold on, give me one." We were up over the peak of the rim, with the hostile projectors under us. I gauged our movement and dropped an explosive powder bomb. It missed and flared with a puff on the rocks, 20 feet from where the two projectors were mounted. I saw the two helmeted figures were down there. They tried to swing their grids upward, but couldn't get them vertical to reach us. The ship was firing at us, but it was far away, and Grantline's search beam was going full power, clean to the ship to dazzle them. Snap circled us, and as we came back, I dropped another bomb. Its silent puff seemed littered with flying fragments of the two projectors and the bodies of the men. We flew swiftly and got in. It decided Grantline. For an hour past, Snap and I had been urging our plan to use the gravity platforms. To remain inactive was surely defeat now. Even if our buildings didn't explode, if we thought to huddle in them, helmeted in the failing air, then Miko could readily ignore us and proceed with his loading of the treasure under our helpless gaze. He could do that now with safety if we refused to sally out, for we couldn't fire our weapons through the windows. To fire a projector through the walls or windows would at once wreck the protective Errant system. The enemy ship has pressure ports constructed for the emission of the weapon rays. Grantline's only weapons thus mounted were his search beam and Z-ray. To remain defensive would end inevitably in our defeat. We all knew it now, it was obvious. The waiting game was Miko's, not ours, and he was playing it. The success of our attack upon the distant, isolated projectors heartened us, and yet it was a desperate offensive, indeed, upon which we now decided. We prepared our little expedition at the larger the exit ports. Miko's Z-ray was watching all of our interior movements. We made a brave show of activity in our workshop with abandoned ore carts, which were stored there. We got them out and started to recondition them. And it seemed to fool Miko. His Z-ray clung to the workshop, watching us. And at the distant port, we gathered the little platforms, the shields, the helmets, bombs, a few hand projectors. There were 6 platforms, three of us upon each. It left 4 people to remain indoors. I need not describe the emotion with which Snap and I listened to Venza and Anita pleading to be allowed to accompany us. They urged it upon Grantline, and we took no part. It was too important a decision. The treasure, the life or death of all these men, hung now upon the fate of our venture. Snap and I could not intrude our personal feelings, and the girls won. Both were undeniably more skillful at handling the midget platforms than any of our men. 2 of the 6 platforms could be guided by them. That was a third of our little force. And of what use to go out and be defeated, leaving the girls here to meet death almost immediately afterward? We gathered at the port. A last-minute change made Grantline order 6 of his men to remain guarding all the buildings. The instruments, the Errant system, all the appliances had to be attended. It left 4 platforms, each with 3 men, with Grantline the controls of one of them. And upon the other 2 of the 6, Venza rode with Snap, and I with Anita. We crouched in the shadows outside the port. So small an army sallying out to bomb this enemy vessel, or be killed in the attempt. Only 16 of us. Only 30 or so brigands. I envisaged, then, this tiny moon crater, the scene of this battle we were waging. Struggling humans, desperately trying to kill. Alone here on this globe. Around us the wide reaches of lunar desolation. In all this world, every human being was gathered here and struggling to fight. Anita drew me down to the platform. "I'm ready, Greg." The others were rising, and we lifted and moved slowly out and away from the protective shadows of the building. In a tiny queue, the 6 little platforms sailed out over the valley toward the brigand ship. Chapter 36, The Battle in the Crater. Grantline led us, and we held about level. 500 feet beneath us, the brigand ship lay, cradled on the rocks. When it was still a mile away from us, I could see all its outline fairly clearly in the dimness. Its tiny hull windows were now dark, but the blurred shape of the hull was visible, and above it, the rounded cap of dome with a dim radiance beneath it. We followed Grantline's platform. It was rising, drawing the others after it like a tail. I touched Anita where she lay beside me, with her head half in the small hooded control bank. "You're going too high." She nodded, but followed the line nevertheless. It was Grantline's command. I lay crouched, holding the inner tips of the flexible side shields. The bottom of the platform was covered with the insulated fabric, and there were 2 side shields. They extended upward some 2 feet, flexible so that I could hold them out to see over them, or draw them up and in to cover us. They afforded a measure of protection against the hostile rays, though just how much we weren't sure. With the platform level, a bolt from beneath couldn't harm us, unless it continued for a considerable time. But the platform, except upon direct flight, was seldom level, for it was a frail, unstable little vehicle. To handle it was more a question of the controls. We balanced and helped to guide it with the movement of our bodies, shifting our weight sidewise or back or forward to make it dip as the controls altered the gravity pull in its tiny plate sections. Like a bird wheeling, soaring, and swooping. To me, it was precarious business. But now we were in straight flight, diagonally upward. The outline of the brigand ship came under us, and I crouched tense and breathless. Every moment it seemed that the brigands must discover us and loose their bolts. They may have seen us for some moments before they fired. I peered over the side shield, down at our mark, then up ahead to get Grantline's firing signal. It seemed long delayed. We were almost over the ship. An added glow down there must have warned Grantline that a shot was coming. The tiny red light flared bright on his platform, and I hissed on our Benson curve light radiance. We had been dark, but a soft glow now enveloped us. Its sheen went down to the ship to reveal us, but its curving path showed us falsely placed. I saw the little line of platforms ahead of us seem to move suddenly sidewise. It was everyone for himself now. None of us could tell where the other platforms actually were placed or headed. Anita swooped us sharply down to avoid a possible collision. "Greg?" Yes, I'm aiming." I was making ready to drop the little explosive globe bomb. Our searchlight ray at the camp, answering Grantline's signal, shot down and bathed the ship in a white glare, revealing it for our aim. Simultaneously, the brigand bolts came up at us. I held my bomb out over the shield, calculating the angle to throw it down, and the brigand rays flashed around me. They were dreadfully close. Miko had understood our sudden visible shift and aimed, not where we appeared to be, but where we had been a moment before. I dropped my bomb hastily at the glowing white ship. The touch of a hostile ray would have exploded it in my hand, and I could see its blue sizzling fuse as it fell. I saw the others also dropping from our nearby platforms. The explosions from them merged in a confusion of the white glare and a cloud of black light mist, as the brigands out on the rocks used their occulting darkness bombs. We swept past in a blur of leaping hostile beams, a silent battle of lights. Darkness bombs down to the ship, struggling to bar our camp search ray, and the Benson radiance rays from our passing platforms curving down to mingle with the confusion, the electronic rays sending up their bolts. Our platforms dropped some 10 dynamite-trained bombs in that first passage over the ship. As we sped by, I dimmed the Benson's radiance, and I peered. We hadn't hit the ship, or if we had, the damage was inconclusive. But on the rocks I could see a pile of ore carts scattered, broken wreckage in which the litter of the 2 or 3 projectors seemed strewn, and the gruesome deflated forms of several helmeted figures. Others seemed to be running, scattering, hiding in the rocks and pit holes. 20 brigands, at least, were outside the ship. Some were running toward the base of our camp ledge. The darkness bombs were spreading like a curtain over the valley floor, but it seemed that some of the figures were dragging their projectors away. We sailed off toward the opposite crater rim, and I remember passing over the broken wreckage of Grantline's little spaceship, the Comet. Miko's bolts momentarily had vanished. We'd hit some of his outside projectors, so the others were abandoned or being dragged to safer positions. After a mile, we wheeled and went back. I suddenly realized that only 4 platforms were in the reformed line ahead of us. One was missing. I saw it now, wavering down close over the ship. A bolt leapt up diagonally from a distant angle in the rocks and caught the disabled platform. It fell, whirling and glowing red, and disappeared into the blur of darkness, like a bit of heated metal plunged into the water. 1 out of 6 of our platforms was already lost, 3 men of our little force gone. But still, Grantline led us desperately back. Anita caught a signal to break our line, and the 5 platforms scattered, dipping and wheeling like frightened birds, blurring shapes, shifting unnaturally in flight as the Benson curve angles were altered. Anita now took our platform in a long swoop downward, and her tense, murmured voice sounded in my ears. "Hold off, I'll take us low." A melee, passing platform shapes, the darting bolts crossing like ancient rapiers. falling blue points of fuse lights as we threw our bombs. Down in a swoop and then rising, away and then back. The silent warfare of lights. It seemed that around me must be bursting a pandemonium of sound. And yet, I heard nothing. Silent, blurred melee, infinitely frightening. A bolt struck us and clung for an instant, but we weathered it. The light was blinding, and through my gloves I could feel the tingle of the overcharged shield as it caught and absorbed the hostile bombardment. Under me the platform seemed heated. My little errant's motors ran with ragged pulse, and I got too much oxygen. My head roared with it. Spots danced before my closed eyes. And then there was not enough oxygen. I was dully smothering. And then the bolt was gone. I found us soaring upward, horribly tilted, and I shifted over. Anita, dear. Yes, Greg, all right. The melee went on. The brigand ship and all its vicinity was enveloped in darkness mist now, a turgid sable curtain, made more dense by the dissipating heavy fumes of our exploding bombs, which settled low over the ship and the rocks nearby. The searchlight from our camp strove futilely to penetrate the cloud. Our platforms were separated. One went by high over us, and I saw another dark close beneath my shield. That's too close. I didn't mean that. I didn't see it. It was almost a collision. Oh, Greg, haven't we broken the ship's dome yet? It seemed not. I had dropped nearly all my bombs. This could not go on much longer. Had it only been 5 minutes? Only that? Reason told me so, and yet it seemed an eternity of horror. Another swoop and my last bomb was gone. Anita had brought us into position to fling it, but I could not. A bolt stabbed up from the gloom and caught us, and we huddled, pulling his shields up and over us. Blurred darkness again. Too much to the side now. I had to wait while Anita swung us back, and we seemed too high. And once again we swooped, but this time not too low. Down in the darkness mist we would have immediately lost direction and crashed. I waited with my last bomb. The other platforms were occasionally dropping them. I'd been too hasty. Too prodigal. Prodigal? That is prodigal, sorry. I'd been too hasty, too prodigal. Had we broken the ship's dome with a direct hit? It seemed not. The brigands were occasionally sending up catapulted light flares. They came from positions on the rocks outside the ship. They mounted in lazy curves and burst over us. The concealing darkness, broken only by the flames of our explosions, enveloped the enemy as well. Our camp searchlight was still struggling with it, but overhead, where the few little platforms were circling and swooping, the flares gave an almost continuous glare. It was dazzling, almost blinding. Even through the smoked pane, which I adjusted in my visor, I couldn't stand it. But there were thoughts of comparative dimness. In a patch where the earthlight struck through the darkness of the rocks, I saw another of our fallen platforms. Snap and Venza. Good heavens. It was not them, but 3 figures of our men. One was dead, and 2 had survived the fall. They stood up, staggering, and in that instant, before the turgid black curtain closed over them, I saw 2 brigands come rushing. Their hand projectors stabbed at close range, and our men crumpled and fell. And now I saw a way we had probably never yet hit the ship. Its outline was revealed. Now, Greg, can you fling it from here? We were in position again, and I flung my last missile, and watched its light as we dropped. On the dome roof, 2 of Miko's men were crouching. My bomb was truly aimed, perhaps one of the few in all our bombardment which would have landed directly on the dome roof. But the waiting marksmen fired at it with short-range heat projectors, and exploded it harmlessly, while it was still above them. We swung up and away, and I saw high above us Grantline's platform, recognizing its red signal light. There seemed a lull. The enemy fire had died down to only a very occasional bolt. In the confusion of my whirling impressions, I wondered if Miko was in distress. Not that. We hadn't hit a ship. Perhaps we'd done little damage indeed. It was us who were in distress. 2 of our platforms had fallen, 2 out of 6 or more, which I didn't know. I saw one rising off to the side of us. Grant Line was over us. Well, we were at least 3. Then I saw the 4th. Grant Line's calling us up, Greg. Yes. Grant Line's signal light was summoning us from above the attack. He was a few thousand feet up. I was suddenly shocked with horror. The search ray from our camp abruptly vanished, and Anita wheeled us to face the distant ledge. The camp light showed, and over one of the buildings was a distress light. Had the crack in our front wall broken, threatening explosion of all the buildings? The wild thought swept me, but it wasn't that. I could see light stabs from the cliff outside the main building. Miko had dared to send some of his men to attack our almost abandoned camp. Grantline had realized it, and his red helmet light semaphored the command to follow him. His platform soared away, heading for the camp, with the other 2 behind him. Anita lifted us to follow, but I checked her. No, off to the right, across the valley. But, Greg, do as I say, Anita. She swung us diagonally away from both the camp and the brigand ship. I prayed we might not be noticed by the brigands. Anita, listen, I have an idea. The attack on the brigand ship was over. It lay enveloped in the darkness of the powder gas cloud and its own darkness bombs, but it was uninjured. Miko had answered us with our own tactics. He had practically unmanned the ship, no doubt, and sent his men to our buildings. The fight had shifted, but I was now without ammunition save for 2 or 3 small bullet projectors. Of what use for our platform to rush back? Miko expected that. His attack on the camp was undoubtedly made just for that purpose. Anita, if we can get down on the rocks somewhere near the ship and creep up on it unobserved in the blackness, I might be able to open its manual hull lock, rip it open and let the air out. If I could get into its pressure chamber and unseal the inner side, it'd wreck the ship, Anita, exhaust all its air. Shall we try it? Whatever you say, Greg. We seemed to be unobserved. We skimmed close to the valley floor a mile from the ship, and headed slowly toward it, sailing low over the rocks. Then we landed and left the platform. Let me go first, Anita. I held a bullet projector, and with slow, cautious leaps we advanced. Anita was behind me. I had wanted to leave her with the platform, but she wouldn't stay, and to be with me seemed at least equally safe. The rocks were deserted. I thought there was very little chance that any of the enemy would lurk here. We clambered over the pitted, scarred surface. The higher crags, etched with earthlight, stood like sentinels in the gloom, and the brigand ship with its surrounding darkness was not far from us. And then we entered the cloud. No one was out here. We passed the wreckage of broken projectors and gruesome, shattered human forms. We prowled closer. The hull of the ship loomed ahead of us, all dark. We came at last close against the sleek metal hull side, and slid along toward it, where I was sure the manual port was located. And abruptly I realized that Anita wasn't behind me. Then I saw her at a little distance, struggling in the grip of a giant helmeted figure. The brigand lifted her, turned, and carrying her, ran the other way. I didn't dare fire. I bounded after them along the hull side, around under the curve of the pointed bow, and down along the other side. I'd mistaken the hull port location. It was here. The running, bounding figure reached it and slid the panel. I was only 50 feet away, not much more than a single leap. I saw Anita being shoved into the pressure lock, and the Martian flung himself after her. I fired at him, but it missed. I came with a rush, and as I reached the port, it slid closed in my face, barring me. Chapter 37. In the pressure lock. With puny fists I pounded the panel. A small pane in it was transparent. Within the lock I could see the blurred figures of Anita and her captor, and it seemed another figure. The lock was some 10 feet square with a low ceiling It glowed with a dim tube light. I pounded and thumped with futile, silent blows. The mechanism was here to open this manual, but it was now clasped from within and wouldn't operate. A few seconds only while I stood there in a panic of confusion, raging to get in. This disaster had come so suddenly. I didn't plan, I had no thought save to batter my way in and rescue Anita. I recall I beat on the glass I had painted with my bullet projector until the weapon was bent and useless, and I flung it with a wild, despairing rage at my feet. They were letting the ship's air pressure into this lock. Soon they would open the inner panel, step into the secondary chamber, and in a moment more would be within the ship's hull corridor, and Anita would be lost to me. The outer panel suddenly opened, and I lunged against it with my shoulder. The giant figure inside slid it. I was taken by surprise, and I half fell inward. Huge arms went around me, and the goggled face of the helmet peered into mine.
So it is you, Haljan. I thought I recognized that little device over your helmet bracket, and there's my Anita come back to me again.
It was Miko. His great bloated arms encircled me and bent me backward, holding me almost helpless. I saw over his shoulder that Anita was clenched in the grip of another helmeted figure. No giant, but tall for an Earthman, almost as tall as myself. Then the tube light in the room illumined the visor, and I saw the face, and recognized it. I gasped. So, I've got you, Miko.
Got me. You're a fool to the last, Greg Haljan. A fool to the last, but you were always a fool.
I could scarcely move in his grip. My arms were pinned, and as he slowly bent me backward, I wound my legs around one of his. It was as unyielding as a steel pillar. He'd closed the outer panel. The air pressure in the lock was rising. I could feel it against my suit. My helmeted head was being forced backward. Miko's left arm held me. In his gloved right hand, as it came slowly up over my throat, I saw a knife blade, its sharpened metal glistening blue-white in the light from overhead. I seized his wrist, but my puny strength couldn't hold him. The knife, against all my efforts, came slowly down. A moment of this slow, deadly combat, the end of everything for me. I was aware of the helmeted figure of Moa casting off Anita, and then the two girls leaping together upon Miko. It threw him off his balance, and my hanging weight made him topple forward. He took a step to recover himself. His hand with the knife was flung up with an instinctive, involuntary balancing gesture. And as it came swiftly down again, I forced the knife blade to graze his throat. Its point caught in the fabric of his suit, and a startled oath jangled in my ears. The girls were clawing at him, and we were all four scrambling and swaying. With despairing strength, I twisted at his waist. The knife went into his throat, and I plunged it deeper. His suit went flabby. He crumpled over me and fell, knocking me to the floor, and his voice, with a terrible gurgling rasp of death in it, rattled my ear grids. Not such a fool, are you, Haljan? Moa's helmeted head was close over us, and I saw that she'd seized the knife, jerked it from her brother's throat. She leapt backward, waving it. I twisted from under Miko's inert, lifeless body. As I got to my feet, Anita flung herself to shield me. Moa was across the lock, backed up against its wall. The knife in her hand went up, and she stood for the briefest instant, regarding Anita and I holding each other. I thought she was about to leap upon us, but before I could move, the knife came down and plunged into her own chest. She fell forward, her grotesque helmet striking the floor grid at my feet. Greg, she's dead. No, she moved. Get her helmet off. There's enough air in here. My helmet pressure indicator was faintly buzzing to show that a safe pressure was in the room. I shut off Moa's Erentz motors, unfastened her helmet, and raised it off. We gently turned her body, and she lay with closed eyes, her pallid face blue cast from the light in the lock. With our own helmets off, we knelt over her. Oh, Greg, is she dead? No, not quite, but dying. Greg, I don't want her to die. She was trying to help you there. She opened her eyes, and the film of death was glazing them, but she saw me and recognized me. Greg? Yes, Moa, I'm here. Her lips were faintly drawn in a smile. I'm so glad you took the helmets off, Greg. I'm going, you know. No. Going back to Mars to rest with the fire makers where I came from. I was thinking maybe you could... Well... Anita gently pushed me down, and I pressed the white, faintly smiling lips with mine. She sighed, and it ended with a rattle in her throat. Thank you, Greg. Closer, I can't talk so loudly. One of her gloved hands struggled to touch me, but she had no strength, and it fell back. Her words were the faintest of whispers. There was no use living without your love, but I want you to see now that a Martian girl can die with a smile. Her eyelids fluttered down, and it seemed that she sighed, and then she was not breathing. But on her livid face the faint smile still lingered, to show me how a Martian girl could die. We'd forgotten for the moment where we were. I glanced up and saw that through the inner panel, past the secondary lock, the ship's hull corridor was visible, and along its length a group of Martians were advancing. They saw us and came running. Anita, look, we've got to get out of here. The secondary lock was open to the corridor, and we jammed on our helmets. The unhelmeted brigands by them were fumbling at the inner panel. I pulled at the lever of the outer panel, and the brigands were hurrying, thinking they could be in time to stop me. One of the more cautious fumbled with a helmet. Anita, run. Try and keep your feet. I slid the outer panel and pushed at Anita, and simultaneously the brigands opened the inner port. The air came with a tempestuous rush. Tempestuous, yes. Sorry. The air came with a tempestuous rush. A blast through the inner port, through the little pressure airlock, a wild rush out to the airless moon. All the air in the ship madly rushing to escape. Like feathers we were blown with it. I recall an impression of the hurtling brigand figures and swift flying rocks under me. There was a silent crash as I struck. Then soundless, empty blackness. We're not quite to an hour, so after this chapter, we're gonna take a short break. I might actually leave a little bit of silence in the recording this time. Usually I just say that we're gonna take a break and then just pause the recording and then immediately come back. But we gotta get through this chapter first. Chapter 35, 6, 7, 8, 38. Is he conscious? We better take him back, get his helmet off. It's over. We can get back now. Venza, dear, we've won. It's over. He hears us. Greg! He hears us. He's all right. I opened my eyes and lay on the rocks. Over my helmet, other helmets were peering, and faint, familiar voices mingled with the roaring in my ears. Get him back to the camp and get his helmet off. Are his motors smooth? Keep him right, Snap. He must have good air. I seemed unheard, but Anita. She was here. Greg. Anita was safe. All four of us here on the earth-lit rocks, close outside the brigand ship. Anita. She held me and lifted me. I was uninjured. I could stand. I staggered up and stood, swaying. The brigand ship, 100 feet away, loomed dark and silent, a lifeless bulk already empty of air, drained in that mad blast outward. Like the wreck of the Planetara, a dead, pulseless hulk already. We four stood together, triumphant. The battle was over. The brigands were worsted, almost the last man of them, dead or dying. No more than 10 or 15 had been available for that last assault upon the camp buildings. It was Miko's last strategy. I think perhaps he had intended, with his few remaining men, to take the ship and make away, deserting his fellows. All on the ship, caught unhelmeted by the explosion, were dead long since. I stood listening to Snap's triumphant account. It hadn't been difficult. Oh, sorry about that. I stood listening to Snap's triumphant account. It hadn't been difficult for the flying platforms to hunt down the attacking brigands on the open rocks. We had only lost one more platform. Human hearts beat sometimes with very selfish emotions. It was a triumphant ending for us, and we hardly gave it a thought that half of Grantline's little group had perished. We huddled on Snap's platform, and it rose, lurching drunkenly, barely carrying us. And as we headed for the Grantline buildings, where still the rift in the wall had not quite been broken, there came the final triumph. Miku had been aware of it and knew he had lost. Grantline's searchlight had leapt upward, swept the sky, and caught its sought-for object, a huge silver cylinder, bathed brightly in the white searchbeam glare. The police ship from the Earth. Chapter 39. My narrative lies now in this permanently recorded form before you, and I prepare my exit bow with a humble hope that I've given you some pleasure. If so, I do beg you to tell me of it. There are some who have already flashed their approval of my discs. I thank them most earnestly and gratefully. My errors of recording unquestionably are many, and for them I ask your indulgence. There have been, I can readily see, errors of omission. I have not mentioned, for instance, the final record of the Planetara's marooned passengers on the asteroid. You'll bear with me, since the disk space has its technical limitations, that such omissions have been unavoidable. Since the passage of the Earth Law by the Federated Board of Education, forcing narrative fiction to cling so closely to sworn facts of actual happening, I need offer no assurance of the truth of my narrative. My witnesses have filed their corroborating declarations. Indeed, the Planetara's wreck and the brigands' attack upon the moon treasure were given wide newscaster publicity, as you all know. And yet I, who was unwittingly involved in those stirring events, may have added a more personal note, making the scenes more vivid to your imagination. I've tried to do that. I do hope that in some measure you'll think I've succeeded. There are many foolish girls now who say that they would like to know Greg Haljan. They doubtless would be very disappointed. I really crave no more publicity, and the girls of all the universe have no charm for me. There's only one for me, an Earth girl. I think life has very beautifully endowed me with its blessings. Alright, that was Thank Hylia, the last fourth of Brigands of the Moon. That story was a real roller coaster, folks. It started out real good. It started out a real neat thing with all its, footnotes and, I'm giving you a narrative in the style of, it's like, it read like someone transcribed a, video blog story time thing from Here and Now, and it was kind of neat. And then it just carried on for far too long. That did not need to be 4 parts. You could have ended it at the second part when you could have not had Miko turn on you. Or you could have had Miko turn on you and just, the saving of the people and getting to the moon. It could have ended when you walked up to Grantline and saw that there were people there and everything's fine and you still had a ship to leave with. It could have ended many places, honestly. It should have ended many places a lot earlier. But anyway, we've got about one more story in this June issue, and I'm gonna see how far into it I can get, because I don't like leaving off on part of the way into a story, but we need to finish the June issue. But I'm gonna take a short break. So, for those of you watching the VOD, I'd suggest pausing the video, make yourself some tea, get some popcorn, a snack or something, stretch your legs. It's not good to sit so still. I'll be back. Anyway, this is Giants of the Ray. Fair warning for the people who are listening to the recording. We may not get through this boy in one sitting. You may have to come back next week. We shall see. Because my Kindle is telling me it's 3 hours long. We'll find out.
I tell you, I'm not crazy, Durkin. They got a big mine.
Bill Durkin laughed roughly and sneered openly at his partner, Frank Maggot.
Juan, you're drunk. Well, I was last night, but I slept that off this morning. I was lying under the table in the Portuguese, and when I opened my eyes, there were those 3 birds sitting next to me. They hadn't spotted me. I heard them talking of wealth, how their mine was unbelievably rich and greater than any other deposit in the world. That means something, doesn't it?
Well, that's all right, but whoever saw a cricket 15 inches long?
Listen, there was 3 of these guys. One was a hell of a fella. His face was piebald with purple spots. His skin was bleached and withered. One of his eyes looked like a pearl collar button. They called him Professor, too. Professor Gurlone. Well, he takes out this cricket thing, and it was a sort of reddish purple. It was alive as long as your forearm. I tell you what. This professor guy says his son take an ordinary cricket, made it grow to the one he had. Well, the mine was what interested me. Kept my mouth shut and my ears open. It's in the Masagrada. Maybe emeralds or diamonds or gold. I'm heading for it right now. That old guy's going back tomorrow and get it.
There's a lot of bunk, growled Durkin, who was stout and red of countenance.
Yeah, well, Otto Ulrich didn't put 50,000 in the bunk.
You mean the German loosened up that much?
Sure, he paid this girl on $50,000. Credit, of course.
Yeah, well, maybe there's something in that mine story, but boy, you were drunk when you saw that forearm cricket. No cricket ever grew that big. You always see things when you get too much rum in you.
I saw it, I tell you.
Durkin feigned elaborate politeness.
Oh, all right, Frank. Have it your way. You saw a cricket that big, and this girl-owned fella took a couple of pink elephants out of his pocket to pay the track. Sure, I believe you.
But money never failed to attract the 2 tropical tramps. They were looking for trouble, not work. And the idea of a raid on a rich mine in the Mato Grosso was just what they would enjoy. An hour later, they had cornered a small, inoffensive peon named Juan. Juan, Maggot, and Durkin had discovered, and come out of the wilderness with Professor Gurlone, the strange-looking gentleman who spoke of a fabulously wealthy mine and commanded checks for $50,000 from a reputable banking firm. Such a man was worth watching. The 2 rascals were expert at pumping the little half-breed. They knew peons, and the first thing that happened was Durkin slipped Juan several dollars, pressed a large glass of whiskey on the little man. The conversation was in broken English and Spanish. Kid sabe. I'm sorry, I can't give this guy a voice and speak it in Spanish. Quien sabe? Durkin and Maggot had this phrase flung at them often during the course of the talk with Juan. There were many elaborate shrugs. There was a mine way back in the Mato Grosso, said Juan. He said he thought it might contain silver. There'd been the shaft of an old mine there. But now they were deep down in the ground, digging out reddish-brown ore, and the cavern smoked and smelled so badly a man could work but an hour or 2 before being relieved. But the pay was very high. Also, Juan, in his rambling way, spoke of grotesque animals. What were those creatures like? Asked Durkin. There came a shrug, and Juan said they were like nothing else on earth. Durkin discounted the part of the story having to do with strange animals. He just thought it was a superstition, but now he was sure there was a rich mine to be raided.
It's the tough part of the Grosso. Sure, I had to carry enough water and supplies to make it. Say, Juan, who was that big Portuguese with Professor Gurlone? He's blind, eh? His eyes were red as milk and his face tanned as river mud. Surely he's a great big guy and tough looking too.
Durkin drummed on the table, considering the matter, while Juan spoke of the big Portuguese. The swarthy man with the colorless blind eyes was Espinosa, former owner of the mine. He'd sold part of his claim to Gurlone's, but remained with him as an assistant. Though blind, he knew the depths of the mine and could feel his way about, and direct the peons in their labors.
I've got it,
said Durkin, turning back to Juan and Maggot.
Juan, it's up to you. You gotta blaze the trail so we can follow you in. You can steal food and cash for use on the way, see? Well, come along there so after Gurlones.
It took some persuading to make Juan consent to their plot, but he yielded at last to money and the promise of part of the spoils.
Maybe you can steal Gurlone's staples, and they'll give us a line on what he's up to out there. Whether it's emeralds or diamonds or gold they're taking out of that mine.
Juan was dumb and superstitious like most of his fellow peons. He'd obeyed orders digging out the red ore, and that was all he really knew. But prompted by the two tramps, he was ready for trouble, too. Juan told them that Professor Gurlone carried a small lead case which he seemed to prize greatly.
Well, go get it then.
The two tramps saw Gurlone's party start on the morrow. There were many cases of supplies loaded into launches, some marked glass, acids, and so on. And then there were boxes of food and various things needed in a jungle camp. Juan, their tool, was working with the other peons, and at 10 o'clock in the morning the launches set out, pushing into the current of the Madeira. Old Gurlone, with a livid face, was in charge of one of the boats, and the gigantic Portuguese, with his colourless eyes and burned complexion, sat beside him. That night, one of the two tropical tramps stole a small boat with a one-cylinder motor and started up the river. It was a hard journey, but they were used to river and jungle work, and the object they had in view was enough to make them discount trouble. They speculated upon what manner of treasure it was that they would find in the cavern of the Mato Grosso mine. It might be precious stones, it might be gold. Certainly it was something very valuable. They carried little supplies, but they were also heavily armed. For food, they might hunt and also depend on the caches left by their friend, Juan the peon. 300 miles from Mananos, they came to the landing where old Gurlone had unloaded his boats. The two tramps drew their own craft up on a shore, a quarter of a mile away, keeping out of sight, and hid the boat in dense brush. Then they crept up the river bank, keeping out of sight of the boatmen who were preparing for the return voyage, and cut into the jungle so as to strike the trail of the caravan ahead. For several hours they followed the path easily. They found palm trees blazed with new marks, and they were sure their friend Juan had left for them. The trail was easy to keep on without these. The supplies had been loaded on burros which had been waiting in the boats. That night they camped beside a small stream. They were but 24 hours behind Professor Gurlone and his party, and the food Juan had cached for them was in good condition. They were up at daybreak and pressed on, armed to the teeth and ready for a fight.
What's that?
Said Durkin, stopping so suddenly that Madget ran into him. They had been walking at a swift pace along the jungle path, the giant trees forming a canopy overhead. Monkeys screamed at them, birds flitted 100 feet above them, in the roof of the forest. The sun beat on the jungle top, but few rays lightened the gloom beneath. From up ahead sounded a frightful scream, followed by a long, drawn-out wailing. Maggot glanced at Durkin, and the latter shrugged and pressed on, but he gripped his rifle tightly, for the cries were eerie. From time to time the two stopped to catch better the direction of the wails, and at last they located the spot where the injured person lay. It was under a great bombax tree, and on the shaded ground writhed a man. The two stopped, horrified at the squirming figure. The man was tearing at his face with his nails, and his countenance was bloody with long scratches. He cursed and groaned in Spanish, and Durkin, approaching closer, recognized Juan.
What do you want? What's the matter? Sick about you?
The face of the sturdy little peon writhed in agony. He screamed in answer, and he couldn't speak coherently. He mumbled and groaned, but they couldn't catch his words. At his side lay a small lead container, and closer, as though he had dropped it after extracting it from its case, lay a tube some 6 inches in length. It was a strange tube, for it seemed to be filled with smoky, pallid worms of light that writhed even as Juan writhed.
What's the trouble?
Hang on, this is Durkin.
What's the trouble?
Asked Durkin gruffly, so he was alarmed at the behavior of the peon. It seemed to both tramps that the man must have gone mad. They kept back from him with ready guns. Juan shrieked, and it sounded as though he said he was burning up in a great fire. Suddenly the peon staggered to his feet and pushed himself up. As he pushed himself up, his hands gripped the tube, and he clawed at his face. Perplexity and horror were written in the faces of the two tramps. Maggot was struck with pity for the unfortunate peon, who seemed to be suffering for the tortures of the damned. He wasn't a bad man, but rather a weakling who had a run of bad luck and was under the thumb of Durkin, a really hard character. Durkin, and while astounded at the actions of Juan, showed no pity. Maggot stepped forward to try and comfort Juan, and the peon struck out at him and whirled around. But a few yards away was the bank of the stream, and Juan crashed into a black palm set with spines, roamed off it, and fell face downward into the water. The glass tube was smashed, and the pieces fell into the stream.
Good heavens, he must be blind. Poor guy, I've got to save him. Go with him.
He grasped his partner's arm and stared curiously down at the dying man.
Let me go, I'll pull him out,
said Madge, trying to wrench away from Durkin.
What you stood for? Why worry about a peon? Look at those fish.
The muddy waters of the stream had parted, and dead fish were rising about the body of Juan. But not about the dying man so much as close to the spot where the broken tube had fallen. White bellies up, the fish had died as though through magic.
Let's get back to Manoas, Bill. This is too much for me.
A nameless fear, which had been with Maggot ever since the beginning of the venture, was growing now more insistent.
What? Turn back now? What do you mean that peon got into a fight with somebody? Maybe got bit by a snake. We'll go on and get the treasure. But what made the fish come up that way? What's the difference? We're okay, aren't we?
In spite of the stout man's bravado, it was evident that he, too, was disturbed at the strange happenings. He kept voicing aloud the question in his mind. What was in the strange tube? But he forced Maggot to go on. Without Juan to leave them caches of food on the trail, they'd have a difficult time getting provender, but both were trained jungle travelers and could find fruit and shoot enough game to keep them going. Day after day they marched on, not far from the rear of the party before them. They took care to keep off Gurlone's heels, for they didn't wish their presence to be discovered. When they'd been on the journey, which led them east for 4 days, the two rascals came to a waterless plateau, which stretched before them in dry perspective. Before they came to the end of this, they knew what real thirst was, and their tongues were black in their mouths, before they caught the curling smoke of fires in the valley, where they knew the mine must be.
That's the mine,
gasped Durkin, pointing to the smoke. The sun was setting in golden splendor at their backs, and they crept forward, using great boulders and piles of reddish earth, strange to them, for cover. Finally they reached the trail, which spread to the hills overlooking the valley, and a panorama spread before them, which amazed them because of its elaborateness. It seemed more like a stage scene than a wilderness picture. Straight ahead of them, as they lay flat on their stomachs and peered at the big camp, yawned the black mouth of a large cavern. This, they were sure, was the mine itself. Close to the mouth stood a stone hut. It was clear this building had something to do with the ore. It was perhaps a refining plant, Durkin suggested. There were long barracks for the peons. Inside a barbed wire enclosure, they could see the little men lounging now about campfires, where frying food was being prepared. Also, there was a long, low building with many windows in it, and houses for supplies and for the use of the owners of the camp.
Looks like they were ready in case of a fight. That fence around the peons looked like they're having some trouble. That's some camp. We gotta find something to drink, come on.
They worked their way about the rim of the valley, and in doing so caught glimpses of Professor Gurlone, the elderly man they'd spotted in Manaus. Manaus, yeah, that's how you said that. They had spotted in Manaus, and also saw the big Portuguese with his sightless eyes. At the other side of the valley, they came on a spring which flowed to the east and disappeared underground farther down.
Plenty water, isn't it?
Said Durkin, lying down on his stomach to suck up the milky water. But they weren't in any mood to be particular about what they drank. The long, dry march across the arid land separating the camp from the rest of the world had taken all moisture from their throats. Maggot, drinking beside his partner, saw that the water glinted and sparkled, though the sun was below the opposite rim of the valley. It seemed that greenish, silvery specks danced in the fluid.
Boy, that's good. I feel like I will fight a wildcat.
Durkin finally found time to say. The water did, indeed, impart a feeling of exhilaration to the two tramps. They crept up close to the roof of the parallel shaft, which they'd seen from the other side of the valley, and looked down into the camp again. Professor Gurlone of the Face and Espinosa the Blind were talking to a big man whose golden beard shone in the last rays of the sun.
That's the old bird's son that Juan told us about. Young Gurlone.
A rumbling, pleasant laugh floated on the breeze, and it was issuing from the big youth's throat. The wind was their way now, and the valley breathed forth an unpleasant odor of chemicals and tainted meat.
This is a funny place. Say, I got one heck of a headache, Will. So bad,
grunted Durkin.
Maybe that water ain't as good as it seemed at first.
They lay in a small hollow, watching the activity of the camp. The peons were in their pen, and it was evident that they were being watched by the owners of the camp. As purple twilight fell across the strange land, the two tramps began to notice the dull sounds which came to their ears from time to time.
That's funny thunder, said Madget nervously. If I didn't know it was thunder, I'd swear some big frogs were around here. Oh, hell, maybe it's an earthquake, said Durkin irritatedly. Goodness sake, what's your belly aching? You done nothing but whine ever since we left Juan. Well, who could blame me?
He broke off suddenly, the pique in his voice turned to a quiver of fear as he grasped Durkin's arm.
Luck!
Durkin, seeing his partner's eyes staring at a point directly behind him, leapt up and scrambled away, thinking a snake was about to strike him. He turned round when he felt he was far enough away, and saw that the ground was moving near the spot where he had been lying. The earth was heaving, as though ploughed by a giant share. A blunt purplish head, which seemed too fearful to be really alive, showed through the broken ground, and a worm began to draw its purple length from the depths. It was no snake, but a gigantic ankle worm, and as it came forth foot after foot, the two watched with glazed eyes.
I've seen 'em 2 foot long, he said, but never like that.
Madget swallowed as he stared on. Durkin, however, when he realized the loathsome creature couldn't see them, and was creeping blindly towards them, with its ugly fat body creasing and elongating, picked up rocks and began to destroy the monstrous worm. He cursed as he worked. Its blood splattered them, and a fetid odor from the gashes caused them to retch, but they finally cut the thing in two and then moved away from there. The dull rumbling beneath them frightened Maggot, and Durkin too, though the latter tried to brazen it out.
Come on, it's getting dark. We can take a look at their mine.
Maggot, who was whimpering, followed him. The booming sounds were increasing. But Durkin slipped down the hillside, and Maggot followed him into the valley. They crept past the stone shack, which they noticed was padlocked heavily. Durkin stopped suddenly and cursed.
Well, cut my foot. These shoes are gone all right from that march. Come on, never mind.
They crept to the mouth of the cavern and peered in.
Yeah,
said Maggot, and he drew back with a shudder. The floor of the mine was covered with a gray slush, in which were seething white masses of slugs weaving in the slime. A powerful rotten odor breathed in their faces, as though they stood in the mouth of a great giant.
Wow,
yelled Durkin, throwing his arms across his face. The greenish ghostly light which emanated from the slime was weaker than moonlight, just enough to see by. A vast shadow hovering above their heads, as though a gigantic bat flew there. The sweep and beat of great wings drove them back, and they fled in terror from such awful corruption. But the flying monster with a wing spread of 8 feet dashed past them and silhouetted against the rising moon like a goblin. Then came another, and finally a flock of the big birds. Durkin and Maggot ran away, passing the stone house which stood near the cavern's mouth. The booming sounds from the bowels of the earth filled their ears now, and it wasn't thunder. No, it issued from the depths of the mine.
We gotta get something to eat,
said Durkin as they paused near one of the shacks. in which shone a light. Sounds of voices came from the interior. They crept closer and listened outside the window. Inside they could see Espinosa, Gurlone Sr., and the big youth with the golden beard, Gurlone Jr. "Yes, Father, I believe we'd better leave at once. It's getting dangerous. I've reached the 5 million mark now with the new process, and it's ready to work with a cell, just as we wish."
"You're that 5 million,"
whispered Durkin triumphantly. "It's all ready in the stone house."
"Why should we leave now?"
said old Gurlone, his livid face working.
"Now when we're just at the point for success in our great experiments? So far, while we've struck many creatures of abnormal growth, still we've overcome them."
"Well, Father, there's something in the mine now which makes it too dangerous to work. That is, until they're put out of the way. You can hear them now." The three inside the shack listened, and so did Durkin and Maggot. The booming sound swelled louder, and the earth of the valley shook.
"I think we better go,"
said Espinosa gruffly.
"I agree with your son, Professor." No, we can conquer this, whatever it is." "You see, Father, while you were away, we broke through into a natural cavern, an underground river. It was then that the trouble started. You know the effect of the stuff on the insects and birds. Enlarged a cricket 100 times, you saw that yourself. 6 of the peons had disappeared. They didn't run away either. They went down the shaft and never came back." They probably fell into the water and drowned. Even if they didn't, we can kill anything with these large bore rifles." "We'd better pull it out and let it alone for a while. The peons have been trying to bolt for several days. They'd be gone now if I hadn't penned them in with an electrified fence." Maggot put his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I'm starving."
Durkin nodded, and they turned away, toward what they had marked as a supply shack. They heard a low murmur from the peon's pen as they began to break off the hasps of the lock, which held the door of the storehouse. "Ooh, excuse me." They got inside with little trouble and began to feel about in the dark for food. They located biscuits and canned goods, which they split open, and these they wolfed hungrily, listening carefully for sounds from outside.
"Here they come,"
said Maggot, gripping Durkin's arm. They looked out the window of the supply shack and saw old Gurlone issue from the building outside, which the two tramps had been listening. In one fan, the old professor, brave as a lion, carried an old-fashioned double-barreled elephant gun, and the rays from a powerful electric torch shone across the barrel. At least they thought the bizarre figure was old Gurlone from the size, for the man was clad in a black, shiny suit, and over his head was a flapping hood of the same material, in which there were large eye holes of green glass. Behind this strange form came a larger one, armed also with a big bore rifle, and another powerful flashlight. The blind Portuguese was armed too, but he wasn't clad in the black suit. He took a stand beside the mouth of the cavern and waited while the two Gurlones entered the mine.
"My foot hurts,"
said Durkin suddenly, breaking the silence.
"I'm going out and seeing what happens,"
said Maggot. Durkin limped after Maggot, who now took the lead. They crept as close as possible to the mine opening and saw the big Portuguese standing there in silence, listening carefully. Any sounds the two might have made were drowned in the great bellowing from within the cavern. These noises, so like the croak of bullfrogs but magnified 1,000 times, were terrifying to the heart. The sweep of wings sounded on the night air, and Espinosa drew back and squatted close to the ground, as immense green creatures, flying on dusty wings, issued from the mine.
"Good heavens, those are moths,"
breathed Maggot. Yet unmistakably they were moths, as large as condors. The green ones, but for their size, were lunar moths, familiar enough to the two tramps. More bats came, disturbed by the entrance of the two Gurlones. Durkin broke then.
I guess you're right, Maggot,
he whispered in a terrified voice.
We should have never come. If my foot wasn't hurt, I'd start for the river now. Cross it when a place.
The booming, vast croaks filled the whole valley, reverberating through the hills. Wails sounded from the peon camp, and the Portuguese was shouting to the Gurlones.
Come out, come out.
Magic gripped his own rifle and stood up bravely. His fear, though it was great, seemed to have brought out the better side of the man, while Durkin, so brave at first, had cracked under the strain.
Look out, they'll see you.
Maggot strode forward, and a blast of fetid, stinking air struck his face, and he choked. The noises were now ear-splitting, but above the bellows came the sounds of those big rifles, the echoes booming through the recesses of the cavern. Then the two Gurlones, running madly, burst from the mine entrance.
Run! Run for your life, Espinosa! I'll help you,
cried Maggot, and Durkin could detain him no longer. The Gurlones hardly noticed the newcomer as they ran madly toward the shelter of their houses. Espinosa joined them, going swiftly in spite of his blind eyes. The croaking made Maggot's brain scream with the immensity of the sound. Luminous white discs, 3 feet in diameter, glared at him, and the creature, which progressed with jerky leaps toward him, almost filled the mouth of the mine. It was hot in pursuit of the fleeing Gurlones. It squatted and then jumped, and presently was out in the night air. Its form was that of a gigantic frog, but it stood some 20 feet in height, and from its throat sounded the terrific bellowing which rivaled the thunder. Maggot bravely stepped forward and began to fire into the huge, soft body. The great mouth opened, and as the dum-dum bullets tore gashes in the blackish-green batracharian. How in the world do you say that? Batrachian? Maybe? I don't know. Batrachian. Hang on. What's the dictionary have to say about it? Batrachian. Hi, can I learn about this word, please? Thank you. Batrachian. Batrachi. Batracha. Batrachia. Batrachian. From the word frog. Another term for a neura. So it's basically it's kind of like a type of frog, essentially, is what it looks like. As the dum-dum bullets tore gashes in the blackish-green batrachian, the thunderous croaks took on a note of pain. The odor of the creature was horrible. Maggot could scarcely draw his breath as he fired the contents of the magazine into the big animal. 2 more jumps brought the frog almost to Maggot's feet, and the tropical tramp felt a whisker-like tentacle touch his face, and bad-smelling slime covered him. The frog was blind, without doubt, from its underground life, but its tentacles seemed to be the way it located its prey, for it turned on Maggot and made a final snap at him. The great jaws closed like a flap of hell, and Maggot leapt back with a cry of triumphant terror. The bullets had finally stopped the big frog, but at its heels came a strange, jelly-like creature, not quite as bulky as the frog, but pushing along on its legs and with a tail some 8 feet thick and 15 feet in length. This, too, evidently a pollywog, was blind and with whitened disc for eyes, but it slid along at a rapid rate because of its size. Maggot's gun was empty. He turned to flee, but the pollywog stopped and sniffed at the thick blood of its fellow. Then, to Maggot's relief, it began to hungrily devour its companion. Utterly filthy and ferocious, the pollywog in silence snapped great chunks from the giant dead frog.
Hello, who are you?
Maggot turned, having forgotten the amenities of life in the excitement. Professor Gurlone and his son, still clad in their black suits but with their helmets off, were standing beside him, clutching their guns and lights. The big Portuguese appeared, and Durkin was beside him.
Why, we just happened to be exploring and we saw your camp. We were on our way in when we heard the noises and came to investigate.
I see. What made you head in this direction? Where's your outfit?
Oh, we cased most of it back there. My partner's hurt his foot, so he can't walk well. Isn't that so, Durkin?
Yeah, I had a sore foot, alright.
Old Gurlone was suspicious of the vague story which Maggot and Durkin concocted as the explanation of their presence in the valley, but evidently the professor was too worried about the situation in which he and his friends were to question the two tramps very closely. In fact, he seemed rather glad that he had two more pairs of hands to aid him, and he thanked Maggot for his bravery. They dispatched the great pollywog as it tore its parents to bit, and then the 5 men, the 2 Gurlones, Espinosa, Maggot, and a limping, cursing Durkin, retired to one of the shacks. The living quarters of the Gurlones was quite elaborate. There were many books on rough shelves, and there was a small bench filled with glass vials and chemicals, though the main laboratory was in one of the long buildings. Professor Gurlone poured drinks for the 5 and welcomed Durkin and Maggot as allies.
We'll need every man we can get if we're to cope with these great creatures. The peons are too frightened to be of use. Luckily it was a frog we came upon on the banks of the subterranean river. There's no telling how many more of those creatures of the same or greater size may be down there. We'll have to destroy them, everyone.
Maggot and Durkin shuddered.
Say,
His face working nervously.
Well, that frog gets so big, I thought I was seeing things, Professor. No, you see, the ore in the mine contains radium, that is, salts of radium. It's a pitchblende deposit and happens to be so rich in radium content that throughout the ages it's affected all the life in the cavern. The arid land surrounding the ore, this has been generally the characteristics of radium deposits, has kept most of the jungle creatures away, but underground beings, such as reptiles, worms, and frogs, have gradually become immune to the effects of the ore and grown prodigiously and abnormally under the stimulation of the rays given off by the radium. This is nothing strange in itself, but never before has such a rich deposit been discovered, so the amounts of radium available have been too small to really check its effect on the growth in animals. That's our chief scientific object in coming here. We realized from Senor Espinosa's description of the plate-out silver mine he had, and from his loss of sight, that he'd stumbled upon a valuable deposit of radium. Usually occurs with silver, that is, the uranium mother ore does, through which the disintegration of which radium is formed. The content of radium per ton of this ore proved unbelievably rich. We were excited. I've always suspected that animal cell might be stimulated in abnormal growth by exposure to radium salts, but such a thing has already been hinted at in the scientific world. Not till our chance came here, however, has enough radium been available for the experiments, you see.
Maggot and Durkin listened with open mouths. Radium meant but vague things to them. They'd heard of the radium paint, which shone in the dark on dials of watches and clothes, but the properties of the metal and its salts were utterly ignorant.
That radium stuff is what makes the funny light in the mine, then?
Exactly. The radioactivity of the elements in the ore give off the light. There are 3 rays, the beta, the alpha, and the gamma. And the professor forgot himself in a lecture on the properties of radium. Durkin, breaking in, asked slyly,
Is radium worth as much as silver?
Young Kenneth Gurlone laughed, and even old Professor Gurlone smiled.
Radium is worth more than gold, diamonds, or platinum. Its value is fabulous. We have $5 million worth already in the form of the chloride.
Whistled Durkin. He glanced sidewise at Maggot.
Yes, $5 million worth of it. Those great monsters who've been developed through the ages by the action of the radium, causing them to grow so prodigiously, are but incidents. We must destroy them so that our work cannot be interfered with. We must use the dynamite to blow them to bits. They're powerful enough to crush the stone bank by the mine and ruin the labels of the last 2 years, gentlemen."
Armed and once more fortified with whiskey, the five made their way outside. The moon was darkened by an immense shadow as one of the giant bats winged its way over their heads, but there were no more monster frogs. The ugly, bulky shapes of the dead pollywog and its parent lay before them.
"We're but safe for the moment. Go and quiet the peons, Espinosa. They will listen to you."
The peons still wailed in terror, and the blind Espinosa slipped silently away.
"Come,"
said Gurlone to his son and Maggot and Durgan.
"I'll show you the laboratory so you can better understand the effects of radium on growth."
The professor led them to the long, low, many-windowed building nearby and flooded it with light. It contained cage after cage in which there were monkeys, pumas, and various jungle folk. These creatures set up a chattering and howling at the light and intruders. Maggot glanced curiously about him. He saw shining vials and glassware of strange shapes on black tables and tubes of chemicals. There were immense screens of dull lead.
"Those are for protection," said Professor Gurlone, "as are the lead cloth suits we wear. Otherwise we'd have burned by radium rays."
Maggot looked about to see if his partner was listening, but he'd gone away. However, Maggot was intensely interested. He went from cage to cage as Professor Gurlone, rather in the manner of a man giving lecture to his students, pointed out animal after animal that had been treated by the radium.
"This is a monkey which usually attains a height of 2 feet. You can see for yourself it's larger than a gorilla now."
The terrible malformed creature bared its teeth and shook its bars in rage, but it was weak evidently from the treatment accorded it. Its hair was burned off in spots and its eyes were almost white. There was a jaguar, and this beast seemed to have burst its skin in an effort to grow as large as 3 of its kind.
"You see, we have not so much time as nature. These beasts cannot be enlarged too rapidly or they would die. They must be protected from the direct rays of the radium, which is refined. In the ore, the action is more gradual and gentle since it's less concentrated, but the metal itself would burn the vital organs out of these creatures, cause them to be struck blind, shrivel up inside, and kill them in a few minutes in the quantity we have. We expose them bit by bit, allowing more and more time as they become, more immune to the rays. Here you see are smaller creatures which have grown some 8 or 10 times beyond the normal size."
All the animals seemed the worse for the wear. Maggot, his brain reeling, yet was beginning to grasp what radium did to one. It wasn't gold you could just pick up and carry away.
If a man touched that radium, what would happen to him?"
"Just what I said would happen to the animals if we didn't give it to them gradually," said Gurlone with a wave of his hand.
"It'd kill him, strike him down as though by invisible poison gas. His heart and lungs would cease to function. Pernicious anemia would set in as the red corpuscles in his blood perished by millions. He'd be struck blind, fall down, and die in agony."
To Maggot came the picture of the unfortunate Juan. As though answering his unasked question, Professor Gurlone went on.
"We had a peon coming up with us. His name was Juan. He stole my sample case, which contained an ounce of radium chloride, and ran off with it. If he opens it, it'll kill him in just that way." "But it didn't occur to you to carry it?"
No. It was encased in a lead container, some 2 inches in thickness. The rays cannot penetrate such a depth of lead. They're trapped in the metal."
Father, you're wasting time,"
broke in Kenneth Gurlone, shaking his yellow head.
"We must act at once. The peons are almost mad with fear. Even Espinosa cannot quiet them, and every moment is precious, for the monsters may break forth."
But Maggot was looking nervously about for Durkin. Where was he? Durkin had his mind on the treasure, and as they turned toward the door, the professor was saying,
"The rays from the ore, which is not so concentrated as a purified metal, do not kill, you see."
Durkin suddenly appeared. He carried his rifle at the hip and limped and cursed angrily.
"Come across. Give me the key to the stone house. Snap on the wood and no argument." The key to the stone bank? Yes, I'll give you 5 counts to throw it over, or then I'll shoot you and take it. I want that treasure, whatever it is, and I'll have it. 1, 2, 3.
The tramp sent a shot over their heads as a warning.
Hey, Bill, easy, easy. That stuff is radium, it'll kill you. Shut up, you little bird, bub. 4.
A tinkle of metal came on the stone floor of the lab as Gurlone tossed his keys to Durkin.
Don't go in that shack, it'll be your death, man. Liar, liar.
Said old Gurlone, turning to Maggot.
So you came to rob us, huh?
But Maggot thought of one, and then he knew he didn't want Durkin, in spite of his failings, to perish so. He ran for the door, across the clearing.
Durkin, Bill, it's Frank.
Great bellowing sounded from the bowels of the earth, but Maggot ignored these in an effort to save his partner. Durkin had the padlock off the stone shack and pulled back the door. As the door disclosed the interior, Maggot could see that a greenish haze filled the entire building. Wan, liquid light streamed forth like heavy fluid. Bravely to save his pal from death, Maggot ran forward, but Durkin had entered the stone shack. Maggot went to the very door of the building, and Durkin was inside. Maggot could see his partner's thick form as a black object in the strange, thick air. A strange scream came suddenly from Durkin's lips, and Maggot wrung his hands and called out for help.
Come out, Bill, come out.
Durkin evidently tried to obey, for he turned toward the door, but his knees seemed to give way beneath him. He threw his arm across his eyes as he sank to the ground, crying in agony, incoherent sounds issuing from his lips. Shriek after shriek the unfortunate man uttered. As Maggot made a dash forward to take a glance with death and rescue his friend, Professor Gurlone and his son Kenneth ran up and threw a black cloak over the tramp. The 3 entered the shack of death, and Maggot, not entirely covered, felt his heart give a terrific jump, and he gasped for breath. Durkin was quivering on the floor, which was lined with lead. Round vials stood about the room like a battery of searchlights, and from these emanated the deadly green haze. But almost before Maggot touched his pal, Durkin was dead. He was curled up as though sewed together by heavy cords. Durkin lay in a ball, a shaking mass of burned flesh. The 2 Gurlones pushed out ahead of them and raised their hands. They had on their suits and helmets.
It's too late for you to do anything for him now. He was headstrong. You can see for yourself that the $5 million does take care of itself. Certain death takes care of it if you go unprotected. These lead cloth suits will keep off the rays for a short time. We always wear them when we're working with the metal, even when we have a lead screen. Oh, Bill, it's terrible.
It was his own fault. He was a thief and he wouldn't let us stop him. I hope it's been a lesson to you, Maggot.
Yes, I want to help you. If you keep me with you, I'll work for you and keep it straight. Give me a chance.
Good. Let's shake hands on it, said Kenneth, and they clasped hands firmly. Espinosa appeared from the darkness. The peons are mad with terror. They cannot be held much longer. They will revolt.
Well, then, we must kill the creatures in the cavern. That'll quiet them more than anything else.
Better close the stone shack, said Kenneth. But as he spoke, a vast shape, another giant frog, appeared in the entrance of the shaft. Get some dynamite and fuses. Come on, Kenneth, and you, Maggot, if you care to wish your life. You need not do so unless you want to. Bravely, the older man led the way towards the croaking monster. The ground shook at its approach. It was heading for the bodies of the dead frog and pollywog, bent on a search for food. Evidently, these vast creatures were forced to prey upon one another for sustenance. The rifles spoke, and Maggot and the professor, in their black suits, protected by the lead cloth and helmets from the rays, advanced. They poured bullet after bullet into the frog. Kenneth came running to join them, and Espinosa stood by. Kenneth had a dynamite, with a fuse ready for lighting and throwing. He also brought out more ammunition, and the three armed themselves to the teeth. It was well after midnight when they started into the mine. They knew they must act quickly or retreat, for the bellowing sounded nearer and nearer the surface of the earth. Each man carried big, powerful flashlights, and the three entered the mine shaft and walked across the seething slugs into the bowels of the earth.
"Stay close together,"
ordered old Gurlone. The mine was easy to descend for the first 100 yards. It led in a gentle slope downward. The way, save for a few giant bats and moths and the big maggots, were clear. The greenish haze, not so bright as that in the death shack, enveloped them, but they still needed their flashes to see clearly.
"Slowly now, take it easy."
The mine spread out now and began a deeper descent. The air was poor, and it was hard to breathe through the mask. Maggot, his heart thumping mightily, listened to the roaring within the depths of the mine. And now the ground seemed to drop away before them. Maggot could hear the running of water, the underground river, and every now and then there came an immense splash, as if some great whale had thrown itself about in the water. A terrifically loud hissing filled their ears. And suddenly before them showed an utterly white snake, with a head as big as a barrel. Its wide eyes glared sightlessly, but its tongue stuck forth for several feet. Kenneth Gurlone coolly tossed a lighted bomb at the creature. The explosion shattered their eardrums, but it also smashed the serpent. The writhing, wriggling coils, bigger than the body of a horse, slashed about, dangerously near. They picked themselves up and pushed on, keeping close to the right wall. A great bat smashed against Maggot and knocked the light out of his hand. But thankfully, the glow was a glancing one, and he was able to retrieve his light and hurry on. They were far from the entrance now. The hole which had been broken through by the peons showed before them. They could see the milky water dashing over the rocks. Pallid eyes looked at them, and they knew they gazed upon another giant frogs. They tossed a bomb at the creature and blew a hole in its back. No sooner had it begun to die than there came a sudden rush of other monsters, and a feast began.
"Throw all together,"
yelled Kenneth Gurlone. Into the vast mass of creatures, who crowded one another in the river for their share of the spoils, they threw bomb after bomb. The dynamite deafened them, and acrid fumes choked them, but they fired their rifles at the prodigious animals, and there in the big river cavern was a seething mass of horrible life, dying in agony. The bellowings and hissings sounding louder, so loud that the earth shook as if actuated by a mighty earthquake.
"My bombs are gone,"
Maggot shouted as he gripped Kenneth Gurlone's arm. He had but a few rounds of ammunition left, and still more of the giant reptiles appeared. A centipede with its creeping, horrible legs topped the mast of squirming matter. They could see the terrific sting of the creature, so deadly when but a fraction of an inch long, and which was now at least a foot, still armed with poison. Then there came the rush of bats and moths, a rush that threw the three men off their feet.
We must have opened the hole more with our bombs," shrieked old Gurlone. "The dead bodies track the other creatures. More and more of them are coming. It's impossible. We can't deal with them all."
The vast gobbling of great animals in the river below was so prodigious that they couldn't grasp it. It seemed it must be optical illusion. In a few moments, the dead had been eaten, swallowed whole, and fights were progressing between the victors. They tossed the rest of their bombs, fired the remaining ammunition. As they prepared to retreat, several of the big creatures sloped over and started up the riverbank into the mine shaft. They ran for their lives, the three, madly with the earth shaking behind them, as they were pursued by a hopping monster of a beetle, with immense mandibles reaching out at them. They dashed for the open air. Giant moths and bats struck at them, and Maggot fell down several times before he reached the outside, and he was bruised and out of breath.
"Come now, there are too many to fight,"
gasped old Gurlone, throwing off the lead suit. But there was no need to talk. The creatures, disturbed by the bombs, had collected in one spot, and shown the way out by one of their number, were coming. Espinosa, with Kenneth Gurlone holding his hand, ran swiftly for the hills surrounding the valley. Maggot old Professor Cologne, who was so out of breath he could scarcely move. The great beetle which had been pursuing them was the first to break forth into the valley. Turning back for a look over his shoulder, Maggot saw the thing pause, but the cavern belched forth a vast array of monsters, the beasts roaring, hissing, bellowing, an increasing mass of sound. They swarmed over the ground, and giant bats and moths winged their way about the heads of the They swarmed over the ground, and giant bats and moths winged their way about the heads of the monsters. At the rim of the valley, the four men paused. "Heaven help the peons," said Kenneth Cologne. Ooh. Sorry, I just needed to grab some water. I have been talking for almost 2 hours at this point. Now the horde of monsters swelled more and more. The bats and moths winged in mad frenzy about the door of the radium shack. There were great beetles, centipedes, ants, crickets, hopping, crawling things, and grotesquely immense in size. Fights progressed here and there, but the majority of them were carried along in the sweep of the multitude.
"See, the radium kills those who get too close," said Professor Cologne in a hushed voice.
The moths and bats were unable to withstand the lure of the green light. They flew with mad beating of wing straight for the open door of the death house, and many of the great creatures, attracted by the light and urged on by an unexplainable force which sent them to death like gnats and moths in a flame, crowded near to the death-dealing radium. Not till the whole shack was covered with quivering forms of the dead did the other creatures veer off and with hops, creepings, and myriad giant legs begin to cover the whole valley. The stone walls of the death shack had crumpled in with the weight, and the other buildings more lightly built gave at once with crackings and crashings. The four men were powerless to assist the unfortunate peons who were trapped in their barracks. The charged wires stopped many of the big beasts, but soon the electric light was short-circuited, and the valley in the moonlight was a seething mass of fighting, dying, feasting monsters. Other sounds, beside those made by the big creatures, came to the ears of the stricken men on the hillside. The breaking of glass, the cries of the jungle animals trapped in their cages, the shrieks of dying peons who were eaten at a gulp by the big frogs or stung to death, impaled on the mandibles of some great stinging centipede. In the spot where the radium death shack had been was a pulpy mass of livid smoky light, and now the bowl of the valley was filled as by some vast jelly. The creatures were slopping over the walls and battling together. The shambles was not yet over, but the four could remain no longer. They made their way down the hillside and struck out across the arid lands. Maggot the tramp became the leader. He was a trained jungleman, and it was he who finally brought them safely to the Madeira. He was their strong man, the one who found the trail and located roots and fruit for the party to subsist on. They nearly perished in the trip for lack of water, but again Maggot was able to supply them with roots, which kept them from dying in agony. They lay upon the river bank now, exhausted but alive. Maggot had assisted old Gurlone, acted as his staff, half carried him the last miles of the trip. Their clothes were almost gone. They were burned to crisp by the tropic sun. Flies and other insects had taken their toll, but Maggot had brought them through. The tall, thin fellow's hair had turned utterly white, but so had his soul.
"You're a good man, Maggot. You've saved us, and you've been brave as a lion." "Professor,"
Maggot said, shaking his head,
"I came into that jungle to rob you. Durkin and I bribed Juan to steal that radium, and I feel responsible for his death. We thought you had diamonds or gold in the Maso Grotto, and we were after it. That's why I'm here."
"You've repaid your debt to us more than fully," said Kenneth, holding out his hand.
"Will you keep me with you, then?"
asked Maggot, anxiously.
Will you go back there?
Professor Gurlone stared at him and then said in a surprised tone,
Why, of course.
But the monsters?
Many of them will die of the outer air. The survivors of the battles will start eating the dead. They'll finally clear away the debris of dead creatures about the radium shack. As each is exposed to the rays of the concentrated metal, it will die. The others will eat it and be killed in turn. Thus they'll be destroyed. If there are any survivors after this evident turn of events, then we'll cope with them when we return reinforced. Dynamite enough of it will finish them off. And Maggot, in your next pursuit after knowledge of strange things, you may get a few earthly riches. The radium's still there and you'll share in it.
Thank you. I'm with you to the end.
You must keep quiet about this. We don't want the world to know too much of our vast store of radium. It would attract adventurers and we'd be annoyed by ignorant men. But we're thankful you lay in that saloon when my father spoke of the millions, Maggot. In Manzos, Maggot found himself a changed man. To his surprise, in spite of his white hair brought on by the horror of what he'd seen, he found that he'd gained 2 inches in height, and he was larger of girth. This, Professor Gurlone had told him, was the effect of the radium rays. Never again did Maggot lie drunk on the floor of a saloon. The events through which he had gone had seared the tramp's soul. He kept close to this new master, Professor Gurlone. Oh, geez, I appear to have miscalculated. There is another story. It just didn't get separated into a different chapter by my Kindle. All right. Well, I guess next week we're gonna hop in on the Moonmaster, because I know I'm probably not gonna be able to finish the Moonmaster. Hang on, just a moment. I want to look at the table of contents. Yeah, there's nothing in the table of contents to suggest that there's anything else but the Moon Men here. Hang on. Let me go to the beginning where it lists everything that's in here. Contents. There is Murder Madness and the Moonmaster, and then the Reader. Heck, that's only like 20 pages, isn't it? Oh no, that's 384 to 421. How many pages is that? Do we have time for that? Math. 384. 421. That's 37 pages. Yeah, we got time. We got all sorts of time. It's fine. Anyway, let's just do the Moonmaster now, so then I can, be done with this issue and, consider things. Ooh, jeez. Now that's an almighty strange noise, Jerry Foster told himself. He dropped the pack from his shoulders and leaned closer to the canyon rim. Miles behind him was the last beaten trail. Jerry wanted peace and solitude and quiet. And now the quiet of the silent mountains was disturbed. From far below came a steady, muffled roar. Faint it was and distant, but peculiar in its unvarying, unceasing rush. It's not water. There's not enough down there. It sounds like a wind that can't quit. Oh, well. He shrugged his shoulders and slipped into the straps of his pack, and then he went again to the granite ledge. I wonder if there's a way down. There was, but it took all of Jerry's strength to see him safely through. On a fan-shaped talus of spreading boulders he stopped. There was a limestone wall beyond, and at its base, from a crevice that was almost... And at its base, from a crevice that was almost a cave, came a furious rush of air and steam. It touched him lightly 100 feet away, and he threw himself flat to escape the hot blast. Endlessly it came, with its soft, rushing roar, a ceaseless, scorching blast from the cold rocks.
"That's all mighty funny,"
mused Foster, and he sniffed the air. There was no order to it.
"And it's warm. Nothing like that in my geology book. What's beyond this? It looks like concrete work, like somebody plastered up the cave."
He picked his way quickly across the rock slope. It was hard going. Below him the rocks and dirt went steep to the canyon floor, and at its foot the blast swept diagonally over the slope. He see what must lay beyond.
Curious. Curious if that's nature's work, and a lot more so if it isn't.
A rock rolled beneath his feet, and then another. He scrambled and fought desperately for foothold in the slipping earth. And then, rolling and clawing, he rode helpless on the slide straight toward the mysterious blast. He felt it envelop him, hot and strangling. His lungs were dry and burning. The blazing sun faded from the rocks. The world was dark. Darkness was still about him when he awoke, but it was cool. The air was sweet on his lips, and it wasn't entirely dark. He turned his head. He was in a room. On a rough-hewn table a candle was burning. Its light cast flickering shadows on walls of stone. Rumbling in his ears was the sound of the blast that had overwhelmed him. It echoed seemingly from far back in the stone cliff. Jerry made a move to sit up, and found that his hands and feet were tied, his body bound to the rough board bed. At the sound of his stirring, a figure came out from the farther shadow. It was that of the man. Jerry looked at him in silence. He was tall, his thin erectness making him seem abnormal in the low room. The lean face was unshaven, and from under a patch of thick hair, a pair of deep-set eyes stared penetratingly at the figure on the rude bed.
"Well, what's the big idea?"
asked Jerry at length. There was no reply, only the intent, staring eyes.
"You got me out of that man trap of yours. You saved my life."
The tall man finally spoke. "Yes, I saved your life. You missed the hottest part of the exhaust. I pumped you full of oxygen."
"Then why tie me up like this?"
Jerry Foster was frankly puzzled. "You're lucky to be alive. Spies are not always allowed." He interrupted himself abruptly. "You were a reporter."
"Wrong."
"Who sent you?"
"Nobody sent me. I heard the noise of your infernal blast furnace and came down to have a look."
"Who sent you? Goodwin? The Stillwater crowd? Who was it?"
I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know who your Goodwin or Stillwater people are. I don't know who you are. I don't give a darn. Get these ropes off me and cut the melodrama. I'll go on my way, and I don't care if I never see you again."
"That's a lie." The tall figure leaned over to shake a bony fist. "You'd report to Goodwin. He stole my last invention. You'll not get this." Jerry considered the wild figure carefully. "He's a nut," he thought, and when he spoke, his voice was controlled. "Now, see here. I don't know anything about this. I'm Jerry Foster. I live in San Francisco. So does Goodwin." "Confound you and your Goodwin. So do a million other people who live there." "I'm getting away from there. I'm heading into the hills for a short vacation. All I want is to get away from the world. I'm looking for a little peace and quiet." The thin man interrupted with a harsh laugh. "Come here, spy, and you tell me you want to get away from the world. And I'm going to be your little fairy godmother. I wish you were Goodwin himself. I wish I had him here. But you'll get your wish. You'll get your wish. You'll leave the world. You shall indeed." He walked back and forth with appreciation of his humor. "Didn't know I was all ready to leave, did you? All packed and ready to go. Supplies all stowed away. Maybe you have enough energy stored to carry me millions of miles. Or maybe you did know. Maybe there are others coming." He hurried across the room to open a heavy door of split logs in the rock wall. "I'll fool them all this time, and you'll never go back to tell them." The door closed behind him. "Crazy as a bedbug," Jerry told himself. He strained frantically at the ropes that bound him. Well, it looks bad for me. The old bird said I'd never go back. Well, what if I die now or 6 months from now? I know that doctor was wrong, though. He tried to accept his fate philosophically, but the will to live was strong, and one of his wrists felt looser at its bonds. Across the room, his pack lay on the floor, and in it was a heavy .45. If he could get the pistol, a knot pulled loose under his twisting fingers. One hand was free, and he worked feverishly at the other wrist. The ropes were suddenly loose. He pulled himself to his feet, took a moment to regain control of the cramped muscles, and then flung himself at the pack. When the heavy door opened, he was behind it, his pistol in his hand. There was no struggle. The lanky figure showed no maniacal fury. Instead, the man did a surprising thing. He sank weakly upon the rough bunk where Jerry had lain, his face buried in his thin hands. I should have let you die. I should have let you die, but I couldn't do that. Now you'll steal my invention, a good one. Jerry was as exasperated as he was amazed. I told you I never knew about anyone named Goodwin. I don't care a hoot about your invention, and as for letting me die, why didn't you? That's a puzzle. You were about to kill me anyway. No, I wasn't going to kill you. You said I'd never go back. I was going to take you with me. Take me where? To the moon. Jerry Foster stared open-mouthed. The pistol lagged in his limped hand. To the moon? See here, I've got you where I want you. And now I'm going to learn what's the back of this. I think you're crazy, absolutely crazy, but tell me, who are you? What do you think you're doing? And what was the meaning of that roaring blast? The man looked up. You don't know. You really don't. No, but I'm going to find out. Yes, you can, now that you've got the upper hand. I guess I was half crazy when I thought I was spied out, but I'll tell you. He sat erect. I am Thomas J. Winslow, he said, and made the statement as if it were an explanation in itself.
Well, that's no burst of illumination of my ignorance.
Come again. The man called Winslow was ready, perhaps anxious to talk. I'm an inventor. I've made millions of dollars. Jerry looked at the chiseled apparel of the speaker and smiled. For other people, you see. The still watch syndicate stole my valveless motor, and then I developed the television set. Goodwin beat me out of that. He'll have that on the market inside of a year. I swore they should never profit by this, my greatest invention. Jerry was impressed in spite of himself by the man's earnest simplicity. What is it? I've broken the atom. First tore the atoms of hydrogen and oxygen apart, disassociated them in the molecule of water, and resolved them into their energy components. That's what you heard. The reaction is self-sustaining, exothermic. That hot blast carried off the heat of my retort. Winslow rose from the bunk, and gone was his listless despondency. Put up that gun. You don't need it now. I think we understand each other better than we did. He crossed with quick strides to the door leading into the cliff. Come with me. I'm leaving today. You won't stop me, but before I go, I'll show you something no other man than myself has seen. He led the way through the doorway. There was another room beyond, Jerry saw. It was a cave. Plainly, Winslow had taken those caves in the rocks and made out of them a laboratory. A lantern gave scant illumination, and Jerry made out a small electric generator, and that was all. He felt a keen disappointment. Somehow this thin-faced man had communicated to him something of his own belief, his own earnestness. What kind of a laboratory do you call this? He demanded, but the other was still busy. In the wall, an opening had been closed with a small iron door, with cement around it. Winslow opened it and reached through. He was evidently adjusting something. The little dynamo began to hum, and there was a crackling hiss from beyond the iron doorway. The opening was flooded with a clear blue light, and then the roar began. It was tremendous, deafening in the echoing cave. You may look now, said Winslow, and stood aside. Jerry peered through. There was another cave beyond. and it was a small metal cylinder, a retort of some kind. The blue light came from a crooked bulb beyond. The retort itself was white hot, despite a stream of water flowing upon it. A cloud of steam drove continuously out and up through a crevice in the rocks. The water flowed steadily from some subterranean stream in the limestone formation. It was diverted for its cooling purposes, but a portion also flowed continuously into the retort. Jerry's eyes found this, and he could see nothing else. For before his eyes, the impossible was occurring. The retort was small, a couple of feet in diameter. It had no discharge pipes, could hold but a few gallons, and yet into it in a steady stream flowed the icy water. Gallons, hundreds of gallons, flowing and flowing, endlessly into a reservoir which could never hold it. The inventor watched Foster with complacent satisfaction. Where does it go? Into nothingness, or nearly that. See? He held up a flask of pale green liquid, and this, exhibiting another that was colorless. I've worked here for many months. I've converted thousands of gallons of water. It's flowed into that retort, never to return. I've gathered this, the product, a few drops at a time. And then the protons and the electrons are reformed. They're static now, unmoving. Call this what you will, energy or matter. They're one and the same. Still, what has all that to do with the moon? You said you were going there. Yes, agreed the inventor. I'm going. This is the driving force. To carry me there, I pass certain electric currents through two liquids. I carry the wires to two heavy electrodes. Between them, the resolution of matter occurs. The current carries these two components together and combine them and form what we call matter. The gases hydrogen and oxygen. Do I need to tell you the constancy is the tremendous explosion that follows? But enough of this. You said I was crazy. I gave you a few bad hours. I've shown you this as much as a matter of recompense. You've seen what no other man has seen. It's enough. He motioned Foster through the door, and the roaring ceased. The inventor returned shortly, the two flasks of liquid in his hands. He transferred both to two metal containers that were ready for the precious load. He carried them with the utmost care as he went out of the doors. Once he returned, and Jerry knew by the crashes from within the inner room that the laboratory work was indeed done, there would be nothing left to tell the secret of whomever might come. He followed Winslow outside, trailing him toward a wooded knoll. There was a clearing among the trees, and in it, hidden from all sides, his eyes found another curious sight. On the ground rested a dirigible, in miniature. Still, it was small, he reasoned, only by comparison with its monster prototype. Actually, it was a sizable cylinder of aluminum that shone brightly in the sun. It was bluntly rounded at the ends, and there were heavy windows, open exhaust ports, a door inside, pierced through thick walls. Winslow vanished within, while Jerry watched in pitying wonder. Despite its size, it was a toy, an absurd and pitiful one, but a toy nonetheless. Real genius and lunacy had many an overlapping line, Jerry reflected, as he approached to look inside, but he found Winslow in a room surrounded by a network of curving lattice struts. The machine was no makeshift of a demented builder. It was a beautiful bit of construction that Jerry Foster examined. How in the world did you ever get this here? What you had in the cave you could pack in, but this, with all these parts, casings, cases of supplies. The inventor didn't even turn. He was busy with some final adjustments. I flew it in. I built it in an old shop I owned out near Oakland. And it flew? Oh, certainly it flew. One drop or less of the liquids you saw, believe it or not. He pointed to a heavy casting at the center of the machine. There were braces tying it heavily and strongly to the entire structure, braces designed to receive and transmit a tremendous thrust. This generator will last expelled through the big exhaust at the stern. These smaller exhausts, well, they go above and below, right and left of the bow. Perfect control, you see. And you flew it here. Jerry was still trying to grasp that incontrovertible fact. And you were going to take me to the moon, you said. He looked above him where a pale, silvery segment showed dimly in the sky. But why the moon? Even granting that this will fly through space. It will. I tried it. Went up to better than 50 miles. Jerry Foster took a minute to grasp that statement and then continued. Granting that, why the moon? There's nothing there, no air, no water, it's all known. The inventor turned to face the younger man in the doorway. There's nothing known. The modern telescopes reach out a million light years into space, but the one place they've never seen, can never see, is less than 250,000 miles away. The moon, of course, you know, it always keeps the same side toward us. The other side of the moon has never been seen, you see. Listen, he said, and his deep-set eyes were afire with an intense emotion. The moon is no tiny satellite. It's a sister planet. It's a world on the end of the rope. We call it gravitation, swung around and around the Earth. How could there be water or anything fluid on this side? It's all thrown to the other side by centrifugal force. Who knows what life is there? No one. I'm going to find out. Jerry Foster was silent, and he was clearly thinking hard. He looked about him at the clean hills, the trees, the world he knew, and he was weighing the secure life he knew against a great adventure. He took one long breath of clear air, as one who looks his last at a familiar scene, and exhaled slowly, but he stepped firmly into the machine. Winslow, do you have any rope handy? The inventor seemed annoyed at this. Why, yes, so. Why do you want it? I want you to tie me up again, and I want you to carry me off as you planned. I want to go with you. The tall man stared at the quiet, determined face before him, and slowly his own strained features smoothed into kindly lines. He grasped it tight at Jerry's hand. I was dreading that part of it, going alone. I would have been so lonely out there. I kind of like the character I've given the scientist so far. Just kind of that very, hurried speech. He's like, I need to get all my words out, so I get my point across before I forget what I'm talking about. I dig it. The shining cylinder of aluminum alloy was hurtling through space. No longer was it a ship of the air. It had thrown itself far beyond that thin gaseous envelope surrounding the Earth, out into the black and empty depths that lay beyond. And in it were two men, each reacting in his own way to an adventure incredible. One was deep in the computation of astronomical data, and the other athrill with a quivering, nerve-shaking joy that was almost breathtaking. A metal grating that had formed the rear wall of their cabin was now the floor. Winslow had thrown the ship into a vertical climb that made of their machine a projectile, shooting straight out from the Earth. Gravitation held them now to the grating floor, and stronger even than the Earth pull was the constant acceleration of motion that made their weight doubled again and again. The inventor moved ponderously, with leaden limbs, to take sights from the windows above, to consult his maps of the sky and check and recheck his figures. But Jerry had eyes only for the Earth they had left. Flat on the grating he lay, his eyes over a thick glass in the protuberance of the shell that allowed him to stare and stare at what lay directly below. He watched the familiar things of Earth vanish in fleecy clouds. Through them there formed the great ball, where oceans and continents drew slowly into focus. And now he was filled with a great sense of solitude. The world and its old, familiar companionship was gone, probably forever. The Earth, his world, that place of vast distances on land and at sea, of lofty mountain ranges and heaving oceans, of cities, countries, continents, was become but a toy, a plaything from the nursery of some baby god hanging so quiet in space that he could almost reach and take it in his hands. Beyond it the sun was blaring, a hard outlined disk in the black sky. Its rays made a shining brilliance of the polar ice cap. Jerry Foster closed his eyes and drew back from the glass. Again he was aware of the generator, whose endless roar reverberated in their compartment. A smaller but similar apparatus was operating on one of the liquids from the inventor's laboratory to generate oxygen and release it inside the room. An escape valve had been set to maintain one atmosphere of pressure about them. Water dripped from a condenser, where both gases were were formed to burn into water vapor and cool to liquid form. One of the windows below admitted a shaft of direct sunlight. It illumined their room with a faint glow. It would never cease, Jerry knew. They were in a place of eternal sunshine, and yet a realm of an endless night. Above him, as Jerry raised his head, the windows framed nothing but utter blackness, save where some brilliant point marked the presence of a star. He missed the soft diffusion of light that makes daylight on Earth. Here there was only the straight beam that encountered one window to make a circle of light on the opposite wall. Jerry looked from a window of heavy glass at the side. This had been the bottom of their ship when they left, and he'd found in the heavens the object of their quest. Clear-cut and golden was half the circle. The rest glowed faintly in the airless void. He tried to realize the bewildering fact. The moon, this great globe that he saw, was rushing, as were they, to their trysting place in space. Jerry stared until his eyes were aching. His mind refused to take hold upon the truth he knew was true. He was suddenly tired, heavy with weariness that was an aftermath of his emotional turmoil. He let his heavy body relax, where some blankets had piled themselves upon the grated floor. The roar of the generator faded into far silence as he slipped into that strange, spaceless realm that men call sleep. The human mind is marvelous in its power of adjustment, its adaptability to the new and strange. The unbelievable is so soon the commonplace. Jerry Foster was to sleep more than once in this tiny new world of Winslow's creating, this diminutive meteor, inside which they lived and moved and thought and talked. The fact of their new existence soon ceased as a topic of wonder. They alternated in their rest, and they counted the passage of time by the hours their watches marked, then divided these hours into days, out there where there were no days. 7 of them had passed when the hour came that Winslow chose for checking their speed. They were driving directly toward the moon, which was assuming proportions like those of Earth. The pilot admitted a portion of the blast to a bow port, and the globe ahead of them gradually swung off. The pilot was reversing their position in space, to bring the powerful blast of their stern exhaust toward the moon, as to resist somewhat its increasing pull. Now their stern windows showed the approaching globe. It was slowly expanding. They were falling toward it. The inventor moved a rheostat, and behind them the stern glass rose to a tremendous roar. Deceleration held with them, an unbearable weight to the rear of the cabin. No thought now for the shining Earth, yellow and brilliant in the velvet sky above. Jerry Foster watched through the slow hours as the globe beneath them enlarged and expanded in ever-increasing slowness. Slowly their falling motion slackened as they cushioned against the terrific thrust of the exhaust below. The globe ceased to grow and held constant. Winslow cut the exhaust to a gentler blast. They were definitely within the moon's gravitational field. Their last hold upon the Earth was severed. Their great globe was resolving beneath them. How about it? How about it? It doesn't revolve like that. Not the moon. We've approached from the other side, but we've overshot it. Say the moon is revolving and the we're swinging about in an orbit of our own. It's the same thing. And soon we shall see, well... He faltered, and his lips trembled, and refused to frame the words of a dream that was coming true. We shall see the lost side of the moon. Will it be what? To Foster, the whole experience had now the unreality of a dream. He couldn't bring himself to the mental focus. His thoughts were blurred, emotions dead. They were approaching the moon, he told himself. It was the moon that was there below them, slowly enlarging now as their own Earth had hung below them, but dwindling when they left. The moon. The moon, it's real. He told himself this over and over, but the numbness in his brain wouldn't be shaken off. His voice when he spoke was casual. He might have been speaking of any commonplace, a ball game or a good show. The sun is coming to my right. We're going around the dark side of the moon. Shall you land there? But no, wait, that was Jerry, not the scientist. The sun is coming from my right. We're going around the dark side of the moon. Shall you land there? Wait and watch. Jerry returned to his circle of glass. and there was a shading of light on the surface below him. From the right, the sun's brilliance threw black shadows and bright beams transversely over a wilderness of volcanic waste. And beyond, where the rays could not reach, was a greater desolation of blackness, its blackness relieved only by a dim light. He realized with a start of amazement that the dim light that he saw was that of their own earth far above. It was lighting their approach to this sister orb. Their side motion was swift as they drew nearer. An hour and more, and they were drawing toward an expanse of utter darkness. The earth light was fading where they passed. They were approaching, in very fact, the other side of the moon. What was below? What mysteries awaited them? He shivered despite the warmth of the generator, cherry red that heated the snug cabin, shivered with unformed thoughts of unknown terrors. But he forced his voice to calm steadiness when he repeated his question to Winslow. "Must we land there? In the dark?" The inventor was piloting his ship with ceaseless concentration. Their falling speed was checked. They were close enough so that the whistling of air was heard merging with the thunder of their exhaust. He moved the rheostat under his hand, and the thunder slackened. "No, you're forgetting your astronomy. This other side is subject to the same conditions as the near side. The sun shines on them all alike, but alternately we're rounding the limb away from the sun. You see, we find, as you see, as darkness that absolutely is kept for the light of stars. Here the earth never shines, and the sun is really only shown during the lunar day, but the sun's creeping down the other side. Their day, the equal to 15 of their days, is beginning. We shall come to the light again. I'm checking our motion across the surface. We'll land, and when it seems best, later on, there will be light." The thin, strong hands of the pilot played over the current and valve controls. Their ship slowly swung and dipped to a horizontal position. A blast from below held them off from the moon, and a bow port was roaring as their speed slowly decreased. Minutes merged endlessly into long hours, as Jerry's eager eyes strained to detect some definite form on the surface beneath. Dimly a glow appeared far ahead. Slowly the darkness faded. They were moving ahead, but their wild speed was checked. And slowly the new earth below took on an outline and form, as the sun's glow crept over it. What would the light disclose? His mind held irrationally to thoughts his reason would have condemned. He found himself watching for people, for houses, lights gleaming from windows. This in a region of cold that approached the absolute zero. The reality came as a shock. The first rays that crept into the vision were silvery fingers of light. They reflected up to the heights in glittering brilliance, and they gathered and merged as the ship drove on toward the sunrise, and they showed to the watching eyes a wondrous, marvelous world, a world that was snowbound, weighted and blanketed with a mantle of white. To Jerry the truth came as a crushing, horrible blow. He turned slowly to look at his companion, to look and be startled anew by the happiness detected on his lean face. "I knew it, I always knew it, but not now. Well..." He became speechless with joy. It's terrible," said Foster. He almost resented the other's elation. It's a hell, just a frozen hell of desolation." "Man, can't you see? Look. The whiteness we see is snow of carbon dioxide. The cold is beyond guessing, but it's clear. The clear places, the vast field, it's ice, man, it's ice." "It's horrible." "Beautiful, marvelous. Think what it means. It means water in the hot lunar day. It means vapor and clouds in the sky. It means that it means that where there is air, there is life, perhaps. Oh, good heavens. No one knows what it all means, and we too shall know very soon." The ship settled slowly to the surface of the new world. Black blobs of shadow became distinct craters. Volcanoes rose slowly to meet them, to drift aside and rise above as they sank to the floor of a valley, and they came to rest upon a rocky floor. On all sides their windows showed a waste of torn and twisted rock. Volcanic mountains towered to the heights, their sides streaked with masses of lava, frozen to stillness these countless years from its molten state. The rising sun, its movement imperceptible, cast long, slanting rays between the peaks. It lighted a ghostly world, white with thick hoarfrost of solid carbon dioxide. A silent world, locked in the stillness of cold near the absolute zero. Not a breath of air stirred, no flurry of snow gave semblance of life to the scene. Their generator was still in the silence, after the endless roaring of endless days was overpowering. But Winslow, hang on, I gotta know, how cold would it be to make carbon dioxide snow happen? So what's the freezing point? What is the freezing point of carbon dioxide? I gotta know. They can't just mention that and not let me know. Negative 57 degrees centigrade, or 109, negative 109 Fahrenheit. If the temperature, so actually, at extremes in Antarctica, there are, maybe not. Vostok, Antarctica is forecast to reach 113 below Fahrenheit on Friday. That's 4 degrees below the freezing point of CO2 and would cause dry ice to freeze directly out of the air. It seemed at the time a reasonable statement. Freezing point of CO2 has already been mentioned. There's been mentions of this phenomenon on other blogs and website. Is it a real thing? Currently, certainly, at least some of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at the poles does freeze out during the winter. However, there's not enough frozen out to accumulate to any extent at the present. So, functionally, at 1 atmosphere, okay, hang on, I'm reading this thing to make sure it's a real thing. For CO2, partial pressure. The constant. Oh, so it's not. So it doesn't. There's not enough CO2 in the atmosphere at the poles to actually cause carbon dioxide snow. But if there were enough carbon dioxide at the poles to cause, sufficient pressure, there could be carbon dioxide snow at our Earth's poles. But if there were enough carbon dioxide in the air to cause that much sufficient pressure, I don't think the poles would even maintain something on the line of negative 113. So, yeah, it's a thought. But anyway, that means it directly maintains negative 109 degrees Fahrenheit highs pretty much constantly. That's very cold. Anyway, picking up where we left off. But Winslow pointed exultantly from one window where an icy expanse could be seen. "That will be water when the sun has risen." He turned on the generator for warmth. The cold was striking through the thick insulated walls. They sat silent, peering out upon the boundless desolation. I'm sorry, there is a noise outside. What in the world is that sound? That is not a happy sound. I guess we'll find out if it's going to hit us. It's whatever. They turned on the generator for warmth. The cold was striking through the thick insulated walls. They sat silent, peering out upon the boundless desolation, upon a world's breathless nakedness, exposed for the first time in all eternity to human eyes. Jerry's mind was searching for some means of expression, but words couldn't come. There were neither words nor coherent thoughts to give vent to the emotions that surged within him. Their watches showed the passage of nearly 2 Earth days before they dared venture forth. They watched the white mantle of frost vanish into gas. From the darkness that they called west, winds rushed shriekingly into the sunrise. Their convection currents off into the sun. In the direct rays, the heat grows intense and the air rises. This is rushing in to fill the void. It'll serve our ends, too. It'll turn the air into a mixture we can breathe to spell the thick layer of CO2 that must have formed close to the ground, you see. More hours and the icy sheet was melting. A film of water rippled in the gusts of wind. Winslow opened the release valve that would permit the escape of air from their chamber and equalize the pressures within and without. The air hissed through the valve, and he closed it so the escape was gradual. We must exercise, you see. We'll decompress slowly like divers coming up from deep sea work. But watch yourself. Remember you're 6 times as strong as you were here on the... remember you're 6 times as strong here as you were on the Earth. Don't jump through the roof. The valve had finally ceased to hiss when Winslow had opened it wide. The air in their cabin was thin. Their lungs labored heavily at first. Jerry felt as he had felt more than once at some great elevation on Earth. But they lived, and they could breathe, and they were about to do what never man had done, to set foot on this place men called the unknown side of the moon. Earth habits were strong. Jerry brought his pistol and a hunting knife out of his pack, and hung them at his belt as the inventor opened the door and sniffed cautiously of the air. Jerry Foster's blood was racing. The air was cold on his face as he rushed out, but it brought to his nostrils odors strange and yet strangely familiar. He was oddly light-headed, irresponsible as a child as he shouted and danced and threw himself high into the air to laugh childishly at the pure pleasure of his light landing. The sun made long shadows of 2 ludicrous figures that went leaping and racing across the rocks. Their strength was prodigious, and they were filled with an upwelling joy of living and the combined urge of an eternity of springtimes. The very air tingled with life. There was overpowering intoxication in this potent, exhilarating breath from a world newborn. The ground that they crossed so recklessly was a vast honeycomb of caves. Between the rocks the soil was soft with the waters from melting ice, and the men laughed as they floundered at times in the oozing mud. Beyond that was a lake, and it was blue with a depth of color that was almost black, a reflection of the deep velvet blackness in the sky overhead. And beyond that was the sloping side of an extinct volcano. Up, up, from up there we'll see the whole world, the whole moon. He laughed as he repeated the exultant phrase, the moon, the whole moon. Despite their strength, which carried them in wild bounds across impassable chasms, their laboring lungs checked them in the ascent. The joyous inebriation was wearing off, and Winslow met his companion eyes sheepishly as they stopped where a sheer cliff of basalt above caught and held the warmth of the sun's rays. Behind them it rose 100 feet, and before stretched a vast panorama. The sun was mounting now in the sky. It brought into strong relief the welter of volcanic waste that extended in bold detail through the clear air far out to the horizon, where, misty and dim, the first vaporous clouds were forming from the steaming earth. And as they watched, the depressing bareness and emptiness of that gray-black expanse was changing. Far to the east a pink flush was spreading on the hills. It wavered and flowed, and as it changed, they watched deep areas of orange and red. The delicate pink swept in waves over valleys and hills, a vast kaleidoscopic coloration that rioted over a strange world. In silence it spilled into the valley below. The slope they had traversed was radiant with color. At their feet the ground was in motion. It heaved and rolled in countless places. Rounded shapes and myriads were emerging. Plants, mushroom growths poured up from the earth to drink in the sunshine of their brief summer. They burst the earth to show unfolding leaves or blunted, rounding heads that grew before the men's incredulous eyes. Winslow was the first to recover from the stupefying beauty of the spectacle. The machine, back to the ship, will be swamped, overwhelmed. He rushed madly back down the slope. Jerry was beside him, a revulsion of feeling driving him to frantic efforts. The piercing beauty that had enthralled him had become a thing of terror. The soft, pulpy, growing things that crushed beneath his feet were a menace in their lust for life. They were a mile or more from the machine. Did they ever find it? The whole landscape had changed. Bare rocks were half hidden now under clean, creeping vines. Only the sun remained as a guide. He must go toward the sun and a little north. He followed Winslow, who was circling a large area of weird growths that were already waist-high. They leapt across a gaping chasm and fought their way over a low hill rank with vegetation, only to be confronted by a maze of great stalks that sprouted as they watched, dismayed, and threw out grotesque and awkward branches. They made one futile effort to force the way, but the trunks, though pliant, were unyielding. To attempt to find their way through the labyrinth was folly. "We've got to keep on trying. We've got to get back," or Winslow, as the look in his eyes showed, needed no ending to that sentence. There was the summer of the lunar day ahead. The inventor did not need to be told of the scorching, broiling heat that would wither the land when the sun struck from straight overhead. And in their ship was food and water and a means of transport to the cooler heights above. It was Jerry who took charge of the situation. Here was a prodigious laboratory in which Winslow's science was useless, but in fighting with nature, even nature as weird as and terrifying a mood as this, Jerry felt himself not entirely incompetent. He looked about him. It had been but an hour since they watched the first onslaught of this life that engulfed them, and now they were cut off. Through an opening, where bare rocks made a rift in the vegetation, he saw again the high ground where they'd stood. There was more rock there on the volcanic slope. The growing things were in clumps, islands rather than continents of rank growth. We must go back and climb while we can. Get to the high ground, take bearings on the place where we left the ship. We'll look over the ground and figure some way to get there. Winslow nodded. He was plainly bewildered, lost in the new jungle. He followed Jerry, who bounded across the crevice in the earth. The ground was rotten with a honeycomb of caves and cracks. Jerry forced his way through and over a rock heap, where the thick trunks of nightmare trees were spaced further apart. There was an opening ahead. He started forward, then stopped abruptly, and motioned the other to silence. From beyond there came sound. There was a rending of soft plant tissue. The song came through the thin air from a grove up ahead, where big plants were waving, though the wind had long since ceased. To their ears came a snoring, blubbering snuffle. A stone was dislodged to come bounding toward them from the hillside. The soft plants were flattened before it. The men cowered in the shelter of a giant fungus. Beyond the rocks, above the mottled reds and yellows of grotesque trees, a head appeared. It waved at the end of a long, leathery neck. All mouth it seemed to the watchers as they saw a pair of short forelegs pulled the succulent tops of the giant growth into a capacious maw. Below there was visible a part of a gigantic grayish body. It was crashing toward them, eating greedily as it came. Back. Go back to that cave. We will hide there in some crack in the ground. They picked their way noiselessly over the rocks. The cave they had crossed offered a refuge from the beast, and it went slantingly down into the ground, a great tunnel deep in the rock. They dropped into the opening and started forward, only to recoil at the fetid stench that assaulted their nostrils.
Great heavens, what a smell!
Gasped Jerry. They stopped, dismayed. Far below them, in the bowels of some subterranean passage, was the crashing of a loose stone. The scrambling and scratching of great claws came echoing to them. They leapt madly for the outer air.
Over here,
Jerry directed, and led the way, crouching, to the concealment of great stalks and vine-covered rocks. He pointed toward the open ground where they had been a few moments before. The tree-eater was out in full view. Its flabby, barrel-like body was squatted like that of some unearthly giant toad on its massive hind legs. It sat, its forelegs hung in the air, as a hoarse, snarling cry came from the cave. The great head, perched on the long, leathery neck, waved from side to side, and the noise from the cave ceased. The rift in the earth was in plain sight from where they cowered, and the eyes of the men were upon it. One instant it was empty, and the next, in uncanny silence, it was filled with huge hideousness, an enormous, crouching beast. It was black, a dull, leathery black. Its thick, hairless hide hung in creases and folds on a gaunt frame. Shorter than the tree-eater, it was still a thing of mammoth ugliness. Its hind legs were powerful and armed with claws that curved deep into the earth, and its front legs displayed the same fearful weapons. A thick, heavy tail slashed forward and back over the ground, and from this to the grinning, heavy-toothed jaws and beady eyes, where the long neck ended in a warty head, it was an incarnation of pitiless ferocity. Was the scent of the hidden, shuddering men in its red nostrils? It forgot them at the sight of the beast in the clearing. The snarling cry echoed hideously in the thin air, as the frightful body came erect with the neck extended, jaws open and dripping. It hurled itself through the air in one terrific leap. Had there been any lingering hope in the minds of the men, they had no carnivores to deal with. The ensuing struggle ended it. The attacker tore great masses of living flesh from the struggling, screaming body, and the first cumbersome brute was helpless before its destroyer. Jerry was trembling and sick at the sight, but he grasped his companion's arm and drew him after as he slipped quietly away. To the high ground. It's our only hope. Perhaps we can fight them off there, find some sort of rock we can climb. They worked their way desperately through the rubbery, obstructing growth. At the foot of the hill there was better going. The bare rock gave winding and twisting passage to the heights. They could have leapt over stunted growths here, could have raced frantically for the high ground, but they dared not. To leap up into view of those fierce, searching eyes, it was unthinkable. They crouched low as they darted from their concealment to the new shelter, and darted behind rocks where open ground must be crossed. They dared regain hope, when again the paralyzing scream ripped through the silence. It was answered by another, and another from distant points. The valley of the caves was spewing out its loathsome dwellers from their winter's sleep. The men raced openly now for the heights, and as he leapt, Jerry turned to see over one's shoulder a pursuer appear. It was one of the flesh-eaters, head to the ground on their trail. At the sight of them its cry rang out again, and it bounded forward in pursuit, and again there were answering screams from the jungle growth. The men threw themselves frantically up the mountainside. Once Winslow landed in a sprawling heap and groaned as he drew himself to his feet. The beast was below them. Jerry seized a great boulder, whose earth weight would have made it immovable, and he raised it above his head and sent it crashing down the slope. Another and another he threw. One struck the beast in midair, and it was pure luck that drove the stone crashing against the creature's head. It fell back with a blood-chilling snarl that was half-shriek. Another monster appeared to throw itself upon the first, and tear at the crushed, waving head. Jerry took his companion by the arm, and his voice came strangled from straining lungs. "Are you hurt? Can you run?" Winslow nodded breathlessly, and again they gathered themselves for their wild, leaping retreat toward the top. An uproar of furious fighting behind them marked where a score of monsters had gathered for the feast. Jerry watched vainly for some refuge, some pinnacle of rock or precipice they could climb, and from which they could beat down their attackers. It was nothing but the welter of volcanic waste, rock heaps and boulders and smooth streams of solid lava. Perhaps in the crater, he thought, over the ragged crest of the cone, might be some place of safety. The pack was in full cry again as they climbed gaspingly to the top. Beyond lay the funnel-shaped crater. Its vast inner slopes were less steep than the hill they'd climbed. They were covered with a jungle like those they'd seen, a maze of red toadstools and distorted trees. Jerry turned savagely to face the oncoming brutes. This, he knew, was the end, for they'd hurled themselves through space to make a morning morsel for these incredible beasts. Oh, geez. So I just looked at how long this story is, and I still have like 20% of the issue to do. So you all know how loath I am to leave on cliffhanger, because it doesn't it doesn't go too well. Because usually by the time I get to it, by the time I get back to it, it just doesn't, I don't remember what's going on. But I don't think I can read 20% more of this book and still have the ability to, speak after that. At least, and I do need to talk tomorrow. So, I think I'm going to call it here. We're gonna find out the fate of our two intrepid moon men next week. And then week after next, I'll probably make, and then after that, we'll probably move on to, after we find out about our moon men, we'll probably move on to one or two things. We'll cross that bridge when we're a little closer, I think. Anyway, guys, this has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.